The harsh, sterile glare of the LED desk lamp reflected off the high-gloss printer paper, illuminating a sequence of numbers that were entirely, deliberately wrong. Forensic accounting was never just about balancing corporate ledgers or moving decimal points. It was about reading the hidden story people tried to bury in the margins. And the story sitting on the mahogany desk at Vance Financial was a tragedy of sheer, unadulterated embezzlement, written in $3.4 million of ghost transactions. The digits blurred together for a fraction of a second, a testament to the fact that I had not slept in 2 days. But when I blinked the exhaustion away, the damning math remained exactly the same. 3.4 million, funneled out of legitimate operational budgets and dumped into a black hole of fabricated invoices. I stood in the center of the corner office, my spine perfectly straight despite the exhaustion clawing at my muscles. Outside the floor-to-soiling windows, the Boston skyline was already darkening into a bitter November evening, the storm clouds rolling over the harbor like a bruised, heavy blanket. But inside, the air was suffocatingly climate-controlled, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the massive servers on the floor below. I had spent 48 straight hours tracing these digital breadcrumbs. I had cross-referenced the shipping manifests with international maritime databases, meticulously untangling the web of dummy corporations he had set up. It was a masterpiece of financial deception, layered so thickly with corporate jargon and legal loopholes that a standard audit team would have glided right over it. But I wasn't a standard auditor. My brain was wired to find the missing puzzle pieces, to see the negative space where the truth was hiding. Every single fraudulent invoice, every hastily approved expense report, pointed directly to the man sitting across from me. Marcus Vance wore his arrogance like the overpowering, metallic designer cologne that preceded him into every room. He leaned back in his leather executive chair, steepling his manicured fingers, entirely unbothered by the mountain of evidence I had just presented. He was a man born on third base, who spent his entire life convincing people he had hit a triple. He assumed I was just a quiet girl with a calculator, someone too terrified of losing her health insurance to question the glaring discrepancies in the quarterly reports. He smiled, and it was a hollow, patronizing expression that made my stomach turn. It was the smile of a predator who knew his prey was backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. "You are overthinking this, Clara," my manager said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for small children. "These are standard consulting expenditures for our harbor transit partners. You just don't understand the complexities of executive logistics. The business world operates on a different frequency up here. You move a few numbers, you grease a few wheels, and the machine keeps turning. That is how the industry functions, sweetheart. You're trying to play referee in a game where everyone else is paying off the judges." "There is no harbor transit partner," I replied, my voice steady, refusing to let him see the slight tremor in my hands. I planted my palms flat on the cold mahogany wood. The LLC registered to receive these funds was incorporated 3 weeks ago in Delaware. The address belongs to a vacant strip mall just off the interstate. I checked the public tax records, Marcus. There are no employees. There is no fleet of transport vehicles. You are authorizing payments for cargo that does not exist, moving company capital into a private, untraceable account. It is fraud. Blatant, federal-level fraud. And I am not signing off on this audit. If my name goes on that final page, I become an accessory. Marcus's private phone buzzed on the mahogany desk while I laid out the corrupted ledgers. I shouldn't have looked. The notification preview glowing on the screen was a wire transfer confirmation from the exact shell corporation I had just spent 3 days dismantling. The amount matched the latest missing expenditure, down to the cent. He snatched the device up quickly, slamming it face down, the patronizing smile vanishing from his face. The shift in the room was immediate, the atmosphere dropping 10 degrees as his posture turned predatory. The mask of the polished corporate executive slipped, revealing the desperate, cornered thief underneath. "You have a very high opinion of your own replaceability," the corrupt executive sneered, standing up to bridge the distance between us. He leaned heavily over the desk, invading my personal space in an attempt to physically intimidate me into compliance. The smell of his cologne was nauseatingly strong now, mixed with the sharp tang of his sudden sweat. "You are a junior auditor drowning in debt. I know exactly how much you owe on those student loans, Clara. I know about the crippling medical bills your mother left behind. The oncology treatments, The hospice care. I signed the paperwork for your pathetic little salary advances. You need this job. You need this paycheck more than you need your pristine moral compass. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of cheap professional attire. He was right about the debt. It was a crushing, relentless tide that threatened to pull me under every single month. I needed the salary with a desperation that tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I thought about the eviction notice currently sitting on my kitchen counter, glaring at me in bold red ink. I thought about the sheer terror of having zero safety net in a city that charged for breathing. If I lost this income, the delicate house of cards I had spent the last 2 years building would collapse overnight. I would be out on the street. I would have nothing. But I didn't sign. I thought of my mother, of the fierce pride she had instilled in me, even when we had nothing but instant ramen in the pantry. She hadn't raised a coward. My signature stays off these documents, I said quietly, gathering my original files with movements that were much calmer than I felt. I stacked the papers meticulously, aligning the edges. I won't go to federal prison for your offshore accounts. You can find another scapegoat. Then you're done in this city, Marcus hissed, his face flushing with sudden, violent anger. He pointed a shaking finger toward the glass door. You are fired, effective immediately. Pack your desk. I will make sure you never touch a corporate ledger in Boston again. I will blacklist you from every financial institution on the East Coast. Security will escort you out in 5 minutes. Get out of my sight. The walk of shame through the open-plan office was a masterclass in professional humiliation. I carried a standard cardboard box containing a framed photo of my late mother, my favorite ergonomic pen, my customized coffee mug, and the forensic accounting certification I had worked myself to the bone to earn. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a mocking frequency, casting long, harsh shadows across the gray carpet. Dozens of my colleagues, people I had helped prepare reports for, people whose shifts I had covered when their children were sick, suddenly found their computer screens utterly fascinating. Not a single person looked up. Not one colleague said a word. The silence of the corporate machine discarding a broken cog was absolute. It was a deafening quiet that underscored exactly how distasteful I had always been to them. I stepped out of the lobby elevators and was immediately hit by the sharp, biting sleet of a Boston winter storm. The night Mark's van left me standing in the freezing rain with my career in a cardboard box was the moment my rigid, hyper-independent survival instincts finally began to crack. The cold wind sliced straight through my thin wool coat, chilling the sweat that had gathered on my skin during the confrontation. The sudden drop in temperature was a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district loomed over me like silent, judging monoliths, their lit windows offering no warmth to the people struggling on the pavement below. I began to walk. The subway was too expensive now. Every dollar had to be aggressively rationed. The physical weight of the box strained my bruised shoulders, but the mental math was infinitely heavier, turning endlessly in my mind. $200 left in checking. Rent was due in 4 days. The electricity would be shut off by Tuesday if I missed another payment. The reality of my poverty was a suffocating blanket settling over my chest, mocking the brilliant financial mind that was completely powerless to save itself. I could unravel millions in hidden corporate assets, but I couldn't conjure up $800 to keep a roof over my own head. The freezing rain soaked through my worn leather boots, numbing my toes. A passing taxi hit a pothole, sending an arc of dirty, icy water splashing against my shins. I didn't even flinch. I just kept moving, putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant acknowledging the absolute freefall my life had just entered. The glowing neon sign of a corner liquor store flickered through the sleet, a dingy beacon of terrible decisions. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell chiming weakly over the low hum of failing fluorescent lights. The cashier, a bored teenager chewing gum, didn't even look up from his phone as I set the wet cardboard box on the floor and walked down the dusty aisle. I bypassed the domestic beer and the cheap vodka, my eyes scanning the bottom shelves. I grabbed a $12 bottle of bitter Merlot. It was a pathetic luxury, a rare lapse in the absolute discipline I had maintained since my mother passed away. But tonight I needed something to blur the sharp edges of my reality. I handed over a crumpled $20 bill, taking my change in heavy coins that weighed down my damp pocket. 5 flights of stairs felt like climbing a mountain. The hallway of my apartment building smelled of boiled cabbage, old dust, and damp wool. The radiator at the end of the corridor was hissing weakly, sputtering steam without providing any actual warmth. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers completely numb from the cold, praying the landlord hadn't already changed the deadbolt. The metal scraped against the lock, catching once, twice, before it finally turned with a reluctant groan. The lock clicked. I pushed the flimsy door open and stepped inside, kicking it shut behind me with the heel of my boot. The silence in the living room was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale cigarette smoke and impending ruin. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't have the energy to look at the peeling wallpaper, the water stains spreading across the ceiling, or the stack of final notice bills piled on the chipped laminate counter. I just set my box of belongings down on the floor, shrugged off my soaking wet coat, and walked straight to the small, wobbly dining table. Keeping my head above water in this unforgiving city was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one unpaid invoice at a time. The sheer exhaustion of fighting a losing battle every single day was finally catching up to me, settling deep into my bones. My fingers, still shaking from the freezing walk and the adrenaline crash, fumbled with the cheap cork of the wine bottle. I didn't have a proper opener, just a plastic multi-tool that slipped twice, slicing a small cut into my thumb before finally catching. The cork crumbled under the uneven pressure, dropping dry, bitter pieces into the dark liquid. I poured it into a water glass anyway, not caring about the floating debris, just needing the sharp burn of the alcohol to numb the panic rising in my throat. I took a large, desperate swallow. It tasted like vinegar and regret, but it burned on the way down, offering a fleeting, artificial warmth against the chill settling in my chest. I picked up the glass again, my vision blurring with tears I had sworn I wouldn't shed for Marcus Vance or his corrupt empire. My hand trembled, a violent, involuntary shudder, born from a lethal combination of cold and absolute despair. The heavy glass slipped from my slick fingers, hitting the edge of the table with a sharp clatter. I stared at the wine, spreading across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping through gauze, my hand still frozen around the empty glass. The crimson stain crept toward the edge, dripping steadily onto the scuffed hardwood floor, pooling in the dark crevices of the wood. It was a minor accident. A stupid, meaningless spill, but it broke me. The hyper-vigilant armor I wore every single day, the ironclad composure I used to navigate a world that constantly tried to grind me down, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I sank into the cheap wooden chair, pulling my knees to my chest, and finally let myself cry. I wept for my mother, whose grave I couldn't afford to visit. I wept for the brutal unfairness of working harder, being smarter, and doing everything right, only to be crushed by a mediocre man with a corner office and a superiority complex. The isolation was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. There was no one to call, no safety net, no one to catch me when I fell. I wiped my wet face with the back of my hand, smearing tears and cheap wine, reaching into my damp coat pocket for a tissue. Instead of paper, my cold fingers brushed against a piece of heavy, matte cardstock. I pulled it out, staring at it in the dim, fractured glow of the street lamp filtering through the living room window. It was a solid black business card, completely unmarked, except for a 10-digit private phone number, stamped in elegant, raised gold lettering, Sarah. My childhood best friend had handed me a stack of recruiter contacts last week, at a chaotic networking event downtown. Before we parted ways, she had pulled me aside, slipping this specific card into my pocket with a secretive smile. She had winked, telling me to use her new direct office line if the corporate toxicity at Vance ever pushed me to the absolute edge. I needed her right now. I needed someone to hear the truth about what had just happened, someone to validate the forensic brilliance that had just gotten me fired and stripped of my livelihood. I needed to vent the venomous frustration building in my veins before it poisoned me completely. I picked up my phone, the screen cracked in the top left corner, illuminating my pale, tear-streaked face. I manually typed in the gold-embossed digits, my thumb slipping slightly on the cracked glass. My vision was still swimming with angry tears and the first dizzying, numbing rush of the cheap wine I had managed to swallow. I pressed the call button, bringing the phone to my ear. I listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times, before the line clicked open into a dead, pressurized silence. There was no automated greeting. No bright professional voice, just the quiet, heavy sound of someone listening intently on the other end, waiting for me to speak. I held my breath, pressing the vibrating glass of the phone tightly against my ear. The silence on the other end remained heavy and absolute. "Sarah, are you there?" I whispered into my phone, my voice sounding impossibly small and fractured in the freezing dark of my apartment. "It's Clara." The heavy pressurized silence on the other end remained unbroken. There was no familiar sigh of sympathy, no sharp gasp of outrage from my best friend. Just a steady, quiet hum that felt strangely intense, like the heavy electric charge in the air right before a lightning strike. I pulled the device slightly away from my ear, squinting at the shattered screen. The call time was ticking upward. 12 seconds. 13, 14. It had connected. Perhaps her phone was on mute. Perhaps it had gone straight to some high-end corporate recording system that didn't bother with automated voice prompts. I didn't care. The cheap red wine was currently flooding my bloodstream, dismantling the heavy iron gates of my professional composure, and I desperately needed to let the poison out before it choked me completely. "I know it's late," I continued, my voice trembling violently as a fresh shiver racked my thin frame. I pulled my knees tighter against my chest, curling my toes into the scuffed hardwood floor in a futile attempt to stay warm. The radiator in the corner hissed and steamed, a pathetic, dying sound that provided absolutely no heat against the biting autumn chill, seeping through the thin walls. "I don't even know if you're listening, or if this is just a recording, but I need you to hear this. I need someone to know the truth. Because if I keep it locked inside my head tonight, I think I might actually lose my mind." I reached out with my free hand, my fingers slipping slightly on the damp glass as I took another deep, ungraceful swallow from the bottle. It burned a fiery, acidic trail down my throat, settling in my empty stomach with a heavy, nauseating warmth. I closed my eyes, letting my head fall back against the hard wooden rungs of the dining chair. The cut on my thumb from the broken plastic corkscrew throbbed, a sharp, rhythmic sting that perfectly matched the pounding of my heart. The entire apartment smelled of damp plaster, stale despair, and the undeniable scent of absolute ruin. "I was fired today, Sarah." I choked out, the words tasting like ash and absolute defeat on my tongue. Marcus Vance terminated me, effective immediately. He had corporate security escort me out of the lobby like I was some kind of criminal, like I was the one who had done something wrong. A ragged sob tore through my chest, harsh and ugly in the quiet room. I pressed the heel of my palm against my forehead, trying to ground myself in the physical sensation of pressure, trying to stop the peeling wallpaper from spinning around me. Clara Higgins had perfected the art of being invisible in that office. Head down, spreadsheets open, never asking for more than my contracted salary. I had spent 2 years swallowing my pride, taking the extra shifts, covering the weekend audits, doing everything humanly possible to secure my fragile position. I was the ghost in the machine, the meticulous auditor who caught every discrepancy, fixed every careless mistake the senior partners made, and silently kept the firm's fiscal integrity intact. "He's stealing," I said, the hysterical edge in my voice suddenly dropping, shifting into the cold, clinical precision that had always been my greatest armor. The tears were still falling, running hot and fast down my freezing cheeks, but the forensic accountant inside me demanded to testify. $3.4 million vanished into a dummy corporation over the span of 4 quarters, and nobody in the executive suite seemed to care. He is siphoning it straight out of the legitimate operational budgets and laundering it through fabricated consulting expenditures. I let out a wet, humorless laugh that echoed bleakly off the low ceiling. It was a dry, hollow sound that barely belonged to me. He thought he was being so incredibly clever. He thought, because he'd layered the missing funds under executive logistics and harbor transit partnerships, that the standard audit team would just rubber stamp the quarterly report and move on. And they would have. The senior partners didn't even bother to look at the cross-border tariffs. They didn't look at the bills of lading. They completely ignored the sudden inflation of operational expenditures in Q3. But I did. I spent 72 hours straight running predictive modeling on the discrepancies, matching the timestamp of every single wire transfer against the firm's legitimate payroll schedule. I took a shaky breath, the sheer force of my anger leaving me lightheaded. The profound isolation of my life pressed down on my lungs, a physical weight that threatened to crush me. I confronted him. I whispered, the fire in my voice suddenly extinguishing, leaving behind nothing but cold, terrifying reality. I laid the corrupted ledgers right on his mahogany desk, and I told him I wouldn't sign. I told him I wouldn't be an accessory to his federal fraud. And do you know what he did? I squeezed my eyes shut, fresh tears squeezing through my lashes. The sickening smell of his metallic designer cologne seemed to linger in my memory, suffocating and predatory. The way his perfectly tailored suit jacket shifted, as he leaned into my personal space, weaponizing his height and his authority against my absolute lack of power. He smiled at me. He leaned over the desk and looked at me like I was a bug he could just crush under his expensive leather shoes. He told me I had a very high opinion of my own replaceability. My voice cracked, fracturing under the weight of my absolute vulnerability. He threw my debt in my face, Sarah. He knew about my mother's hospice bills. He knew about the oncology treatments that bled my savings completely dry before she passed away. He knew I was drowning. He looked me in the eye and told me that I needed the paycheck, more than I needed my pristine moral compass. I wiped my nose with the back of my hand, my breath hitching uncontrollably in the dark. And the worst part? The part that makes me hate myself. I sobbed quietly into the receiver, my shoulders shaking violently under my thin, threadbare sweater. For one terrifying second, I almost signed it. I thought about the bright red eviction notice sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about my checking account being completely overdrawn. I thought about having zero safety net in a city that charges for the privilege of breathing. And I almost compromised everything my mother taught me, just to keep a roof over my head. I stared at the dark, spreading stain on the tablecloth, forcing my spine to straighten. The raw grief was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, desperate need to document the truth. I was an accountant. I survived on facts, on hard data, on the undeniable architecture of numbers. Numbers never lied, even when men did. But I didn't, I said, my tone hardening. I refused, so he fired me. He promised to blacklist me from every accounting firm on the East Coast. He told me I was completely done in this city. I took the phone away from my ear for a fleeting moment, staring at the glowing screen. The call duration was at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The line was still open. The unyielding quiet was still there, unwavering and intensely observant. It felt less like a recording now, and more like a massive breathing entity waiting in the dark. I brought it back to my mouth. Let me tell you exactly how he did it, Sarah, I stated, my analytical mind fully taking over the emotional wreckage. Just in case he tries to erase my network drives by tomorrow morning. You need to know the exact structural weaknesses of his scheme. Outside the reinforced, bulletproof glass of the Beacon Hill penthouse, the bitter autumn sleet hammered against the city skyline. A chaotic storm that mirrored the usual violence of the Boston underworld. But inside Don Alexander Ravellini's private study, the atmosphere was a study in absolute, controlled stillness. The air in the massive room was rich and heavy, carrying the deep, masculine scent of aged cedarwood, expensive leather bindings, and the subtle, smoky hint of the single malt whiskey resting on the desk. Alexander sat perfectly motionless behind the hand-carved mahogany desk. He was a man composed entirely of sharp, uncompromising lines. His broad shoulders filled out a tailored, bespoke charcoal gray suit that cost more than most men made in an entire decade. His dark, storm gray eyes were fixed on the far wall, his intense focus entirely consumed by the sleek, matte black secure phone pressed against his ear. That specific phone was a direct, heavily encrypted line. Only 3 people in the entire world possessed the gold-embossed card bearing its 10 digits. And all 3 of them were men, who knew better than to call after midnight, unless a major harbor shipment had been seized by federal agents, or blood had been spilled on Ravellini territory. When the device had vibrated precisely at 11:30, Alexander had expected a crisis. He had mentally prepared for a tactical response, for the cold, calculating deployment of violence required to protect his empire. He had not expected the shaky, tear-streaked voice of a woman. He had picked up the receiver without speaking, demanding identification through his deliberate, evaluating silence. But before he could issue a single commanding word, she had started talking. And Alexander, a sovereign predator who demanded absolute control over every conversation, found himself entirely captivated, completely incapable of hanging up the receiver. The voice coming through the encrypted line was trembling, punctuated by wet, shivering breaths and the slurred edges of cheap alcohol. Yet, beneath the obvious physical exhaustion and terror, the underlying intellect was diamond sharp. He incorporated an offshore dummy LLC 3 weeks ago. The woman's voice echoed directly into Alexander's ear, her tone suddenly shifting from hysterical grief to the cold, clinical precision of a seasoned auditor. He registered it to a vacant strip mall just off the interstate. No actual employees, no fleet of transport vehicles, but he was authorizing massive payments for maritime cargo. Cargo that doesn't physically exist. Alexander's jaw tightened, the muscle near his ear twitching as he listened. He remained perfectly silent, his breathing shallow and controlled, so as not to alert her to his presence. The details she was rattling off with flawless accuracy were sending a cold, lethal realization straight through his veins. I cross-referenced the shipping manifests with the international maritime databases. The brilliant, broken woman continued, dismantling a multi-million-dollar laundering scheme with effortless mathematical grace. The cubic volume of the supposed freight didn't even mathematically align with the gross tonnage capacities of the vessels he claimed were transporting it. It was lazy. It was mathematically impossible. He used the exact same registered agent for the shell company that he uses for his own personal tax filings. It is a masterpiece of arrogance, and it is a federal crime. Alexander's long, strong fingers traced the edge of his crystal whiskey glass. He brought the amber liquid to his lips, taking a slow, contemplative sip. His mind, usually a fortress of strategic compartmentalization, was rapidly processing the sheer magnitude of what he was hearing. The highly encrypted Boston Harbor ledger had been bleeding capital for 6 months. Alexander had personally scrutinized those digital files. He had known there was a leak, an internal hemorrhage of funds orchestrated by someone inside his own organizations, skimming off the top. But he hadn't found the precise entry point. Not until this very second. Marcus Vance. Marcus's firm. He knew the name. He knew the man. They were a mid-tier corporate consulting group downtown. They were small players. Legitimate businessmen who'd occasionally brushed against the edges of the city's gray markets, pretending they understood how the real underworld operated. But the offshore dummy LLC, the exact shipping routes this woman was describing, they matched the ghost operations his own underboss, Enzo Gallo, had been attempting to conceal. Enzo had been using Marcus's firm to wash stolen port tariffs behind Alexander's back, setting up the shell company as a ghost terminal for the family's untraceable cash. And this weeping, shivering accountant sitting in the dark had just cracked a high-level mafia laundering syndicate wide open from her dining room table. These men were arrogant, soft men who wore expensive cologne and thought they were apex predators, simply because they could manipulate a quarterly spreadsheet. But this man, this pathetic, mediocre executive, Marcus Vance, had just thrown away an absolute diamond because he was too stupid to recognize its immense value. He had threatened a woman who possessed a mind sharp enough to secure an entire empire, attempting to crush her spirit by exploiting her grief over her deceased mother and her crippling medical debt. Alexander felt a sudden, dark surge of territorial violence coil tightly in his chest. It was a completely irrational, possessive instinct, foreign and violently demanding. He did not know this woman named Clara. He had never seen her face. He did not know the color of her eyes or the exact shape of her mouth. All he knew was the fierce, unyielding pride that refused to sign a fraudulent document, and the heartbreaking vulnerability of her confession. "I don't know what to do." Clara's voice suddenly cracked, the analytical armor falling away entirely, leaving behind nothing but raw, bleeding exhaustion. "I am so unbelievably tired from fighting a losing battle every single day. I can unravel millions in hidden corporate assets, but I can't conjure up the $800 I need to pay my rent on Tuesday. I have nothing left. I'm completely, utterly alone." A sharp click echoed through the receiver. The line went dead. Alexander lowered the phone slowly, setting it back onto the mahogany desk with meticulous, deliberate precision. Her final words hung heavily in the warm air of the study, a stark, painful contrast to the absolute luxury surrounding him. While he sat in a climate-controlled fortress, protected by legions of armed men and limitless wealth, she was shivering in a dark, freezing apartment, weeping over a ruined career and an impending eviction. She thought she had nothing. She thought she was entirely disposable. Alexander's dark eyes narrowed into a cold, lethal resolve. The Omerta code he lived by was built on loyalty, on recognizing true value and protecting it with extreme prejudice. In his world, incompetence was punished with swift violence, but brilliance, especially brilliance paired with unyielding loyalty to one's own moral compass, was rewarded with absolute, unconditional protection. Marcus Vance had made a critical, terminal miscalculation. He had fired the one person capable of saving his pathetic firm, and in doing so, he had blindly pushed her directly into the crosshairs of the most dangerous man in Boston. Alexander stood up, his movements fluid and decisive. He walked toward the floor-to-soiling windows, looking down at the sleet-slicked streets of the city far below. The storm was worsening, the harbor waters churning violently in the dark. Somewhere out there, in the freezing labyrinth of the city, a brilliant broken woman was trying to sleep in the cold, believing her life was completely over. She had no idea that her life was just beginning. He turned away from the glass, his long strides carrying him back to the mahogany desk. He picked up the secure phone once more, his thumb pressing a single speed dial button. The line rang exactly once before it was answered. Don Ravellini. Franco Moretti's voice came through the speaker, crisp, alert, and devoid of sleep despite the late hour. "Franco," Alexander commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of a sovereign king. "I am sending you a phone number. It belongs to a woman named Clara who just dialed my private line." "Understood, boss," Franco replied smoothly, the sound of a mechanical keyboard already clacking rapidly in the background. "Is there a threat level?" "No," Alexander stated coldly, his eyes darkening as he stared out at the freezing rain. "She is a civilian. But she just uncovered Enzo Gallo's missing ledgers. I want her full identity. I want her exact residential address, her employment history at Marcus Vance's firm, her outstanding medical debts, and her current banking ledgers." "How deep do you want the background check?" his head of security asked, his professional tone never wavering. "Everything," the mafia boss ordered, his tone shifting into something darker, something fiercely protective that left no room for negotiation. "I want to know the name of the hospital that treated her mother. I want to know the name of her landlord. I want a complete, comprehensive dossier on my desk before the sun rises." "And the woman herself?" Franco inquired, already anticipating the order. The image of her shivering in the dark burned itself into Alexander's mind with fierce, possessive intensity. He would not allow a mind like hers to be wasted. He would not allow a woman with that much unyielding pride to be crushed by a mediocre corporate thief. "Locate her," Alexander commanded softly, the absolute finality in his voice ringing clearly through the line. "By morning, I want her out of that freezing apartment. Wake Teresa Rossi. Tell her to prepare the East Wing guest suite. I want the heat turned up, I want fresh food prepared, and I want her safe. Place my heavy cashmere overcoat in the SUV. She will not spend another second shivering in that storm. Bring Clara to my desk. Discreetly, Franco. She has been terrified enough for one night." "Yes, Don Ravellini. I will have the security team mobilized immediately." Alexander ended the call, placing the phone face down on the desk. The silence returned to the study, but it was no longer the empty, stagnant quiet of a late-night audit. It was the tense, coiled anticipation of a predator preparing to strike, of a sovereign king mobilizing his forces to claim the one asset he suddenly realized his empire desperately needed. Tomorrow, Marcus Vance was going to learn a very painful, very permanent lesson about the true consequences of corporate corruption. And Clara, whoever she was, wherever she was hiding, was going to learn exactly what it meant to be under the absolute, unbreakable protection of the Ravellini family. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, metallic whisper, revealing the subterranean nerve center of the Ravellini empire. The climate down here was entirely different from the warm, cedar-scented study above. The air in the security hub was chilly, carrying the sharp synthetic bite of ozone and the steady hum of overheated processors. It was a sterile, windowless vault buried deep in the Massachusetts bedrock, lined with floor-to-soiling server racks and a massive wall of glowing monitors that bathed the room in an eerie, persistent blue light. The silence in the surveillance room was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of static electricity and imminent retaliation for anyone foolish enough to cross the family. The men who operated these terminals were ghosts, silent sentinels who controlled the digital flow of the entire eastern seaboard. Their loyalty to the Ravellini family was absolute, bought not with fear, but with an unshakable code of honor that Alexander had instilled from the day he took power. Franco Moretti sat at the primary console, his posture rigid and uncompromising despite the late hour. His fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard with practiced, lethal efficiency. Alexander stepped out of the elevator, his tailored charcoal gray suit absorbing the harsh light of the screens. He did not need to announce his presence. The subtle shift in the room's air pressure, the sheer gravitational weight of the dawn's arrival, was enough to make the two junior security analysts at the far end of the room instantly sit straighter, their eyes fixed firmly on their own tasks. Alexander walked to the center console, standing directly behind his head of security. He clasped his hands behind his back, his dark gaze scanning the cascading lines of encrypted code scrolling across the primary monitor. "Status," the Mafia boss demanded, his tone a deep, gravelly vibration that cut through the mechanical hum of the servers. "I have locked onto the incoming signal from your private line, boss," Franco reported, his tone entirely devoid of inflection, a pure professional executing a high-stakes directive. The call originated from a cellular device operating on a prepaid, low-tier network. It bounced off 3 separate civilian nodes before hitting our encrypted firewall. "I am deploying the surveillance database now to isolate the exact point of origin." Alexander watched as a highly detailed digital map of the city materialized on the central screen. "I want absolute discretion, Franco. Enzo Gallo has eyes in the banking district and ears in the municipal police precincts. If Righteous Underboss realizes I am suddenly investigating Marcus Vance's corporate firm, he will panic. Panic leads to erratic behavior, and erratic behavior destroys harbor shipments." "Understood," his head of security replied smoothly. "We are bypassing the standard municipal telecom grid entirely. I am routing the trace through our offshore servers. Gallo's people won't see a single blip. To the rest of the city, this search does not exist." The technical dominance of the Ravellini intelligence network was absolute. It was a digital phantom, a deeply embedded architecture that monitored the city's pulse, without ever leaving a physical footprint. Alexander stared at the glowing map, watching as the search radius rapidly shrank. It started with the entirety of the greater metropolitan area, then narrowed to a specific quadrant of the city, dropping away the wealthy suburbs and the pristine banking district. The glowing red pulse settled over a densely populated, dilapidated neighborhood on the fringes of the industrial zone. The satellite overlay shifted, rendering the streets in stark, high-resolution imagery. It was an area defined by crumbling brick tenements, failing infrastructure, and a creeping, relentless poverty. The specific building the signal pulsed from was a 5-story walk-up. The fire escapes were rusted shut, the roof was patched with cheap black tar, and the street lamps outside had been shattered and left unreplaced. Every detail screamed of systemic neglect. Alexander's jaw tightened. The stark visual contrast between his reality and hers was suddenly glaring. He stood inside a multi-million-dollar subterranean fortress, surrounded by absolute power and unlimited resources, while the brilliant mind that had just untangled a mafia laundering syndicate was trapped in a decaying sector of the city, where the heat probably didn't work and the deadbolts were easily broken. Triangulating the cell tower ping, Franco narrated quietly. The map zoomed in further, isolating the specific apartment unit on the top floor, isolating the residential data. No active security cameras in the lobby, no doorman. It's a high-risk structure. Anyone could walk right up to her front door. "Run the municipal lease records for that exact unit," Alexander commanded softly, his eyes darkening as he absorbed the vulnerability of her location. "Cross-reference it with the employee roster you pulled from Marcus's company." The surveillance database churned for exactly 3 seconds before a high-resolution photograph appeared on the left side of the screen, pulled directly from a corporate ID badge registry. Alexander stopped breathing for a brief heartbeat. The woman on the screen was not smiling. She stared back at the camera with an expression of quiet, guarded endurance. She possessed sharp, elegant features, pale skin that looked chronically deprived of sunlight, and dark hair pulled back into a severe, highly professional knot. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Even through the sterile, low-quality corporate lens, her eyes burned with a fierce, intelligent defiance. It was the look of a woman who had been backed into a corner by a cruel world but absolutely refused to drop her gaze. A survivor. "Clara Higgins," Franco stated, reading the data populating rapidly beside her photograph. 27 years old. Junior forensic accountant at Marcus's firm. "Clara," Alexander repeated. The name tasted foreign on his tongue, yet it carried an immediate, undeniable gravity. This was the woman who had wept into his ear. This was the woman who had refused to compromise her pristine moral compass, even when faced with the absolute destruction of her livelihood. Clara Higgins had perfected the art of being invisible, boss. Franco continued, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as new data streams opened. No social media presence, no criminal record, Not even a parking ticket. She exists entirely off the radar, moving strictly between her apartment and the corporate office. I am initiating the deep dive into her economic and medical history now. The surveillance database was not merely a tool. It was a weaponized extension of Alexander's will. It tapped into the city's traffic cameras, silently hijacked the municipal banking algorithms, and sifted through terabytes of raw data in seconds. Alexander watched the algorithms dissect the accountant's digital footprint. Every grocery store purchase, every subway swipe, every meager utility payment was cataloged and laid bare. The extreme frugality of her existence painted a devastating picture. She wasn't living, she was barely surviving. Poverty was a relentless tide, and she had been drowning one unpaid invoice at a time. Alexander felt a slow, dark anger uncoiling in his chest. In the world of the Italian-American mafia, true loyalty was the highest currency. The Omerta Code dictated that you protected those who demonstrated honor, and you mercilessly crushed those who abused their power. Marcus Vance was a parasite. He was a weak, narcissistic coward who wore bespoke suits and used systemic corporate leverage to terrorize a brilliant, defenseless woman. He had exploited her isolation. He had weaponized her vulnerability. "Keep digging," Alexander murmured, his eyes fixed intensely on the pale curve of her jaw in the photograph. The faint shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes even in a static image. The toll of her labor was profoundly visible. "I want the exact figures of what she owes, and to whom. I want the names of the creditors. I want the names of the doctors." "The banking extraction algorithm is running," Franco confirmed, his eyes never leaving the screen. "It will take a few hours to penetrate the encrypted hospital servers and the federal loan databases without triggering any cybersecurity alarms. I will compile the complete dossier and bring it to your study before dawn." Alexander nodded slowly. The initial shock of the phone call had completely faded, replaced by a cold, strategic clarity. He turned away from the central console, the heavy charcoal gray fabric of his suit shifting silently as he moved toward the elevator. His incredibly heavy, warm charcoal gray cashmere overcoat, carrying the scent of expensive cologne, remained upstairs draped over his leather armchair, but down here in the frigid air of the server room, the fire in his blood provided all the heat he needed. "Do not fail me, Franco. When the sun comes up, her old life officially ends." 4 hours passed. The violent sleet storm that had battered Boston all night was finally beginning to exhaust itself, transitioning into a fine, freezing mist as the first pale, bruised light of dawn crept over the harbor. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the Beacon Hill study, the temperature was perfectly regulated. The cedar logs in the massive stone fireplace had burned down to glowing, orange embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the hand-carved mahogany furniture. Alexander Ravellini sat in the high-backed leather chair behind his desk, entirely unaffected by the lack of sleep. His mind was a hyper-vigilant fortress, calculating the exact geopolitical fallout of removing Marcus Vance and neutralizing Enzo Gallo in a single surgical strike. The heavy oak doors of the study opened with a quiet, solid click. Franco stepped into the room, carrying a thick physical manila folder. In an empire built on encrypted digital ledgers and untraceable offshore servers, a physical paper file was a rarity. It meant the information was too sensitive, too vital, to exist solely in the vulnerable ether of the network. It meant absolute permanence. Alexander extended a hand. He did not speak. The head of security crossed the Persian rug, his footsteps entirely silent, and placed the heavy folder squarely in the center of the desk. Clara Higgins, the complete background file, boss. From the moment she was born until the exact second she dialed your private line. Alexander picked up the folder. The thick matte cardstock felt rough against his fingertips. He opened it slowly, the ambient light of the desk lamp illuminating the dense stacks of paper within. He stared at the ink spreading across the accounting ledgers, like blood seeping through a gauze, his analytical mind instantly dissecting the architecture of her pain. The first section detailed her academic and professional record. It was flawless. A perfect GPA from a rigorous state university. Certifications in forensic auditing, corporate tax law, and advanced predictive modeling. She possessed an intellect that could have easily dominated Wall Street. Yet, she had deliberately chosen a mid-tier firm, accepting a salary that was insultingly below her market value. Alexander turned the page, and the reason for her sacrifice became devastatingly clear. Her mother, Franco stated quietly, standing at parade rest on the opposite side of the desk, diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 oncology markers 3 years ago. Clara was 24. She had just graduated. She took the job at Marcus's corporate firm because they offered immediate, comprehensive health insurance on day one. She needed the coverage to keep her mother alive. Alexander read the medical billing records. The numbers were staggering, a grotesque testament to a broken healthcare system. Chemotherapy treatments, radiation therapy, experimental drug trials, and finally, the astronomical costs of round-the-clock hospice care. She had drained her savings. She had maxed out every line of credit. She had taken out predatory personal loans just to afford pain medication for a dying woman, prioritizing her mother's comfort over her own basic survival. The economic warfare of poverty was documented in 14 separate collection agencies, making automated calls to her phone every 6 hours. A relentless digital harassment that never allowed her a moment of peace. The physical weight of her burden was incomprehensible. Single daughterhood, bearing the agonizing weight of a dying parent with absolutely zero support, was a quiet, suffocating martyrdom. Alexander traced his thumb over a past due notice from a pharmaceutical supplier. She had been carrying the weight of the world entirely on her own, staring down an impossible abyss without blinking. Her mother passed away 8 months ago, Franco continued, his voice devoid of pity, but filled with a deep, objective respect. Since then, Clara has been drowning. Marcus Vance discovered her economic vulnerability immediately. The corporate HR records show a distinct, abusive pattern. He denied her promotions. He blocked her lateral transfers to other departments. He forced her to stay at her desk until 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve to finish his personal audits. He deliberately kept her isolated, underpaid and utterly dependent on the firm. Alexander's long fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, the knuckles turning a stark, dangerous white. He read the logs of the salary advances. The corrupt executive had essentially trapped her in a cycle of indentured servitude. He had loaned her company money at exorbitant corporate interest rates, using the debt as a leash to force her into compliance. He had expected her to be a quiet, obedient ghost who would rubber stamp his multi-million-dollar fraud simply because she was too terrified of eviction to speak up. He underestimated her, the mafia boss said softly, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal pride. He looked at a woman who had survived the absolute worst agony this world has to offer, and he thought she was weak. He thought her poverty made her a coward. He made a fatal miscalculation, Franco agreed. She refused to sign the audit, and now she has nowhere to go. Her checking account is currently overdrawn by $42. Her landlord has initiated eviction proceedings. She has precisely zero safety net. Alexander closed the file, the heavy cardboard slapping against the mahogany wood, with a sound like a judge's gavel. The anger that had been simmering in his chest all night finally crystallized into absolute, unyielding resolve. This was not a woman who needed pity. Pity was an insult to a survivor of her caliber. She needed sovereignty. She needed a fortress where her brilliant mind could thrive without the constant, paralyzing terror of economic ruin. And Alexander, a man who commanded an invisible empire of immense wealth and lethal force, possessed exactly the resources required to build that fortress around her. "The debt is erased," Alexander commanded, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of a sovereign king. "All of it. Contact the holding companies managing her student loans. Contact the medical billing departments at the hospital. Contact the predatory lenders. I don't care what it costs. Pay them off, close the account, and have the physical receipts delivered to my desk by noon. Consider it done, Don Ravellini," Franco replied, already pulling a secure tablet from his jacket pocket to execute the wire transfers. "And Marcus Vance?" Alexander's eyes darkened into a stormy, terrifying abyss. "He is a corporate parasite. I want his firm acquired. Have our shell companies execute a hostile takeover of his entire business the second the market opens. Buy out his board of directors, freeze his executive assets, strip his name from the lobby of that building. And when you bring him to the federal authorities for the harbor fraud, make sure they understand that his protection in prison will cost a premium he can no longer afford." Franco nodded slowly, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He will be broken before lunchtime." Now, Alexander, standing up from the desk, he smoothed the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit, his presence expanding to fill the massive study. He looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the pale dawn light was finally piercing through the heavy clouds, illuminating the sprawling city below. "Is Teresa Rossi awake?" Yes, boss. The East Wing guest suite has been prepared. The heat is on, the linens are fresh, and the security perimeter around the penthouse is locked down. Good. Alexander picked up the gold-embossed card that sat on the corner of his desk, running his thumb over the raised lettering. The tactile sensation grounded him in the reality of the moment. The heavy matte black surface, with its elegant lettering, was the single thread that had connected her desperate world to his impenetrable one. The quiet, shivering accountant was about to step out of the freezing rain and into the absolute center of the mafia underworld. She would be terrified, she would be defensive, but she would be safe. For the first time in her life, she would not have to fight alone. Deploy the vehicles, Franco. Bring her to me. I woke to the sensation of a jackhammer systematically dismantling my frontal lobe. The dull, throbbing pain behind my eyes was a fierce, unrelenting reminder of the cheap red wine and the catastrophic destruction of my entire life. My apartment was freezing, the air biting and hostile. The hissing radiator in the corner had finally given up entirely during the night, leaving the ambient temperature hovering somewhere just above the freezing point. I lay on the worn, lumpy cushions of my second-hand sofa, still wearing the damp wool trousers and thin sweater from yesterday's storm. The stiff fabric scratched against my neck, a miserable tactile detail that perfectly matched the bleak reality of my existence. My mouth tasted like bitter ash, dry copper, and profound regret. I forced my heavy eyelids open, wincing sharply as the pale, bruised morning light filtered through the cracked plastic blinds. The events of the previous evening crashed over me in a suffocating, violent wave of anxiety. The confrontation with Marcus Vance, the cardboard box sitting on the floor containing my shattered career, the terrifying realization that my bank account was overdrawn, and the red eviction notice was ticking down like a synchronized bomb. And then, the phone call. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, my head swimming dizzily as the blood rushed from my brain. I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples, desperately trying to piece together the fractured, alcohol-soaked memories. I had called Sarah. I had pulled that heavy cardstock from my pocket and dialed the number on the gold-embossed card. I had poured out the entire forensic breakdown of the massive embezzlement scheme to a silent line. Panic, cold and incredibly sharp, pierced through the heavy fog of my hangover. Had it been a recording, or had someone actually answered? The absolute suffocating silence on the other end felt terrifyingly real in the sober, unforgiving light of day. My cracked phone buzzed on the chipped laminate counter while I pressed a cold hand to my forehead. I shouldn't have looked. I should have ignored it, assuming it was just another automated collection call from the hospital billing department, or a final, aggressive warning from my landlord demanding the overdue rent. But the forensic accountant in me was rigidly trained to confront the data, no matter how catastrophic the numbers appeared. I stood up on unsteady legs, my bare feet flinching against the freezing, warped hardwood floor, and walked slowly over to the tiny kitchenette. I picked up the device, my thumb brushing over the spiderweb cracks in the glass. The screen illuminated, displaying a rapid, cascading sequence of push notifications from the specialized financial news aggregators I followed for corporate audits. It wasn't a collection agency. It was an avalanche of breaking news alerts. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my dry throat. The headlines were screaming in bold, urgent typography. Vance Financial acquired overnight in hostile takeover by undisclosed holding company. CEO Marcus Vance terminated and detained amid federal fraud allegations. Entire executive board replaced before opening bell. I blinked, my analytical brain stalling completely for an instant as I processed the digits printed in stark black ink. The words simply did not make logical sense. Corporate acquisitions of that magnitude required months of exhaustive due diligence, aggressive board meetings, endless legal negotiations, and SEC approvals. They did not happen in the span of 6 hours between midnight and dawn. And Marcus, a man who had spent his entire pathetic career successfully burying his crimes beneath layers of high-priced legal immunity, being detained by federal authorities before his morning coffee. It was mathematically and legally impossible. My fingers trembled violently as I opened the top financial article. The details provided by the journalists were incredibly scarce, citing a sudden massive influx of offshore capital and a buyout orchestrated by an anonymous international conglomerate. But the photograph attached to the article was undeniable, high-resolution proof. It showed my former manager, his arrogant face now pale, sweating and absolutely terrified, being escorted out of the glass-walled lobby of our building, in heavy steel handcuffs by federal agents. It was the exact same lobby he had ordered corporate security to throw me out of less than 12 hours ago. A profound, dizzying shock rooted me to the spot. I stared at the image spreading across the cracked screen like blood seeping through gauze. It was poetic justice, swift, brutal, and absolute, but it felt entirely surreal. Who in this city had the liquid capital, the invisible leverage, and the sheer predatory speed to dismantle a legitimate corporate firm overnight? Before my hyperactive brain could process the variables, 3 sharp, authoritative knocks hammered against my apartment door. I jumped, nearly dropping the fragile phone onto the floor. The sound wasn't the tentative, polite tap of a neighbor, nor was it the impatient, erratic rap of my landlord. It was a measured, heavy sound that demanded immediate, unquestioning compliance. It was the physical manifestation of absolute authority. My heart began to hammer a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I looked down at my disheveled state, the wrinkled, damp clothes, the sheer exhaustion etched deep into my pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes. I moved toward the door with slow, silent steps, my hyper-vigilant survival instincts screaming at me to hide in the bathroom and pretend the apartment was empty. I pressed my eye to the scratched brass peephole, fully expecting to see local police officers or aggressive debt collectors ready to seize my meager belongings. Instead, I saw 2 men who looked like they had stepped out of an entirely different dimension. They stood in the dim, foul-smelling hallway of my tenement building, completely undisturbed by the peeling floral wallpaper or the lingering scent of boiled cabbage and damp rot. They were incredibly broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing impeccable, bespoke, charcoal gray suits that screamed of generational wealth and quiet, lethal danger. The man standing directly in front had sharp, distinctly Mediterranean features and a calm, stoic expression that betrayed absolutely nothing. He was not a corporate executive, and he was certainly not a debt collector. He radiated a very specific kind of violence, the kind that was highly disciplined, perfectly contained, and entirely loyal to whoever held his leash. I stepped back from the door, my breathing turning shallow and erratic. The walls of the tiny apartment suddenly felt like they were shrinking, closing in on me. I had just exposed a multi-million-dollar laundering scheme over an unsecured phone line. I had threatened to blow the whistle on a corrupt executive, and now 2 men in custom tailoring were standing outside my door at 7 in the morning. The man knocked again, the sound echoing loudly in the small space. "Miss Higgins," a deep, perfectly calm voice filtered through the thin, cheap wood. "My name is Franco. Please open the door. You are not in any danger, but we have strict orders to bring you in before the freezing rain begins again." How did he know my name? How did he know this exact address? The unlisted, cheap apartment I had rented completely under the radar to avoid the hospital's collection agencies? "Who sent you?" I demanded, my voice trembling violently, despite my desperate attempt to sound strong and unbothered. I kept the heavy deadbolt firmly engaged, my hand gripping the cold metal lock as if it could actually stop them if they decided to simply kick the door off its hinges. "The man you called at 11:30 last night," Franco replied simply. The remaining air vanished from my lungs. The gold-embossed card, the silent waiting line. I hadn't called Sarah. I had called someone else entirely. Someone who possessed the terrifying power to bankrupt a company overnight, summon federal agents, and dispatch armed men to my door before breakfast. I don't know who that is," I stammered, my logical mind scrambling for a tactical defense, trying to build a wall of plausible deniability. I dialed a wrong number. It was a complete mistake. I was intoxicated. "It was not a mistake, Clara. It was the most intelligent decision you have ever made," the head of security said smoothly, his tone lowering into something almost reassuring. "Now, please unlock the door. We have a secure vehicle waiting downstairs, and it is freezing in this hallway. Our employer wishes to offer you a position that matches your actual intellect, and he does not like to be kept waiting." I looked over my shoulder at the damp cardboard box sitting on the floor, containing the pathetic, accumulated remnants of my professional career. I looked at the bright red eviction notice resting on the counter. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. My financial safety net was completely gone, my mother was buried, and the terrifying men on the other side of this door were the only remaining variable in an equation that currently equaled 0. I reached up with a shaking hand, my bruised fingers grasping the metal mechanism, and turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked loudly. I pulled the door open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Franco stood in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the interior of my freezing apartment in a fraction of a second. His gaze didn't hold an ounce of judgment, only a clinical, hyper-efficient assessment of my vulnerability. He silently noted the dying radiator, the threadbare coat I was wearing, and the sheer exhaustion vibrating through my small frame. "Good morning, Miss Higgins," Franco said, stepping back slightly into the hallway to give me physical space. He did not invade my boundaries. His demeanor was one of profound professional respect, a stark contrast to the condescension I had endured from Marcus. "Please, bring only what you truly need. Everything else will be handled." "Handled?" I echoed, my voice tight with suspicion and disbelief. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means you no longer live in this building," he stated, delivering the information as if it were an undeniable, fundamental law of physics. "Your lease has been terminated and paid in full by our organization. Your outstanding medical debts have been fully liquidated. You are coming with us." 10 minutes later, I was walking out of the dilapidated tenement building, clutching only my mother's framed photograph and my forensic accounting certification tightly to my chest. The bitter morning wind whipped aggressively through the thin wool of my coat, biting at my exposed skin, but the harsh cold barely registered against the absolute surrealism of the moment. Easing silently at the curb, directly in front of the shattered street lamp, was a massive, high-end black town car. Its tinted windows were completely impenetrable, and the sleek, armored chassis looked like a stealth predator, resting quietly on the crumbling, trash-strewn asphalt. It was a vehicle designed exclusively to transport heads of state, foreign dignitaries, or sovereign kings of the underworld, and it was waiting specifically for me. The second man, who had remained entirely silent during the extraction, stepped forward and opened the heavy rear door. The interior was a cavern of immaculate black leather and soft, warm ambient lighting. I hesitated for a split second, the deep-seated fear of being trapped warring with my sheer physical exhaustion. The 2-foot gap between the icy pavement and the warm interior of that car represented a threshold from which I knew I could never return. If I stepped inside, I was surrendering my independence to an unknown, immensely powerful entity. I was stepping blindly into the shadows of an empire I didn't understand. "You are safe now, Clara," Franco said quietly from behind me, his tone holding a surprising, unexpected trace of gentleness that cut through my panic. "I promise you. The man you are about to meet protects what belongs to his organization with absolute prejudice, and after listening to your analysis last night, he considers your mind a very valuable asset." I took a deep, shuddering breath, the freezing mist stinging my lungs, and slid into the back seat. The heavy door closed with a solid, hermetic thud, instantly severing me from the chaotic, miserable noise of the city. The contrast was physically jarring. Outside was grinding poverty, freezing wind, and the relentless crushing pressure of daily survival. Inside the town car, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of rich bespoke leather, faint cedarwood, and absolute, uncompromising security. The ambient heat radiating from the vents immediately began to thaw the painful numbness in my fingers. The vehicle pulled away from the curb with a smooth, powerful glide that barely registered any mechanical vibration. I sat rigidly against the soft, luxurious leather, staring out the heavily tinted glass as my decaying neighborhood rolled past and quickly faded into the distance. We merged seamlessly onto the expressway, heading straight toward the towering, glittering skyline of the financial district. The silence inside the cabin was not the suffocating, heavy quiet of my apartment. It was a deliberate, insulated peace. I watched the city wake up through a dark filter, the chaotic traffic and the swirling sleet completely isolated from my new reality. My forensic mind, ever desperate for empirical data, began to rapidly process the variables. The instantaneous corporate buyout of Marcus Vance, the total liquidation of my massive medical debts, the encrypted phone line, the armored vehicle. This was not a rival consulting firm trying to poach talent. Standard corporate entities did not operate with this level of ruthless, terrifying efficiency. They relied on corporate lawyers, lengthy board meetings, and strict regulatory compliance. The power that had dismantled my problems overnight operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law. It was an underworld sovereignty, a shadow empire that commanded billions without ever appearing on a public tax return. I had accidentally audited the mafia. My heart skipped a beat, a sudden, sharp spike of acute terror crystallizing in my chest. I pressed my hand flat against the warm leather seat, desperately grounding myself in the tactile reality of the moment. I had exposed a complex laundering scheme that belonged to an illicit organization. I had given them the exact maritime coordinates of their stolen funds over an open phone line. I wasn't just a whistleblower. I was a massive liability if I went to the authorities, and an incredibly dangerous asset if I worked for them. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, my voice slicing through the quiet. I tried to keep my tone steady, projecting confidence, but the slight tremor in my syllables betrayed my rising panic. Frank sat in the front passenger seat, his posture relaxed but highly alert as he watched the road ahead. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his dark eyes calm and assessing. "We are heading to the Beacon Hill headquarters. It is the central nerve center of our operations. And who exactly is your employer?" I pressed, my fingers tightening nervously around the wooden frame of my mother's photograph until my knuckles turned white. "A man who values absolute loyalty and unparalleled competence above all else," Franco replied evenly, his voice carrying a deep reverence. "You demonstrated both of those traits last night. He prefers to introduce himself in person." The heavy car glided off the expressway, navigating the pristine historic cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill. The architecture outside the window shifted rapidly from modern steel to classic red brick and creeping ivy, the generational wealth in this elite sector of the city quiet, dignified, and deeply entrenched. We approached a towering glass-walled monolith that seemed to dominate the entire city block. It was a masterclass in modern architectural intimidation. From the outside, it looked like a high-end international investment bank, but my detail-oriented eyes immediately caught the subtle anomalies. The unyielding security perimeter, the reinforced steel bollards hidden behind decorative planters, the tinted, bulletproof perimeter glass, the complete lack of public corporate signage. It was an impenetrable fortress masquerading as a financial building. The town car didn't stop at the main lobby entrance. Instead, it bypassed the street level and descended a steep, hidden ramp into a private underground parking garage. The heavy steel gates rolled shut behind us with a definitive, locking clatter that echoed through the concrete. The subterranean vault was pristine, bathed in bright, sterile LED light and filled with perfectly aligned rows of identical black SUVs. It was a military staging ground, completely hidden beneath the city. The vehicle came to a smooth, silent halt. The engine cut off, plunging the cabin back into absolute silence. The doors unlocked with a soft click. The driver stepped out and opened my door, offering a brief, highly respectful nod. I stepped out onto the polished concrete floor, my cheap, scuffed boots echoing loudly in the cavernous, immaculate space. The air down here was cool, smelling faintly of exhaust, high-octane aviation fuel, and ozone. "This way, Miss Higgins," Franco instructed, gesturing toward a private, glass-enclosed elevator bank, guarded by two more heavily armed men in bespoke suits. They didn't even look at me. Their gaze focused outward in a state of constant, unwavering vigilance. I followed him, my legs feeling entirely numb, as if I were moving through a dream. Every single step carried me further away from the desperate, invisible life I had lived, and deeper into a world of absolute command and terrifying power. The elevator doors parted with a soft, melodic chime. The interior was lined in dark, polished mahogany and mirrored glass, reflecting my exhausted face. "He is waiting for you in the top-floor executive suite," the head of security said quietly as I stepped inside the car. He reached out and pressed a polished silver button, labeled with a single, deeply embossed R. "Remember, Clara, you have nothing to fear. You are no longer navigating this city alone." The doors slid shut, sealing me inside the luxurious chamber. The elevator began its rapid, silent ascent, climbing smoothly toward the absolute apex of the Boston skyline, carrying me upward toward the dangerous, mysterious man who had bought my entire world while I slept. My reflection in the mahogany-paneled mirror showed a pale, terrified woman, still wearing yesterday's damp clothes, clutching her mother's framed photograph like a shield. I was a forensic accountant who dealt in absolute certainties and balanced ledgers, but right now, I was hurtling toward an equation I had no idea how to solve. The numbers had always been my safe haven. Now, the only thing keeping me safe was the absolute terrifying power of the dawn waiting at the top. The melodic chime of the elevator signaled my arrival at the absolute apex of the Boston skyline. The mirrored mahogany doors slid apart silently, pulling me out of my isolated reflection and thrusting me into a realm of staggering, unimaginable wealth. There was no bustling reception area. There were no ringing phones, no frantic junior partners running with stacks of paper. The top floor of the Ravellini headquarters was a fortress of absolute, pressurized stillness. The air here felt distinctly different. It was heavy, rich with the subtle, masculine scent of aged cedarwood, expensive leather bindings, and the faint, lingering trace of a wood-burning fireplace. My scuffed, damp boots sank into a deep Persian rug that likely cost more than my entire lifetime of expected earnings. I clutched the framed photograph of my mother, and my accounting certification tighter against my chest, the cheap cardboard backing pressing into my sternum like a physical anchor to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the sprawling corner office. Floor-to-soiling windows offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of the churning Boston Harbor and the mist-covered financial district far below. The natural light filtering through the reinforced glass was cool and gray, but the interior of the room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of brass lamps and the dying embers in a massive stone hearth. And then I saw him. The man seated behind the sprawling hand-carved mahogany penthouse desk was a study in lethal, uncompromising stillness. Alexander Ravellini possessed a physical presence that immediately commanded the oxygen in the room. He was broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing a pristine, charcoal gray bespoke suit that hugged the powerful lines of his frame with meticulous perfection. He did not look like a corporate executive. He looked like a sovereign king holding court, a predator resting quietly at the absolute top of the food chain. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I had spent years analyzing the behaviors of arrogant, wealthy men who used their expensive cologne and loud voices to project a false sense of authority. But the man sitting across the room required no such theatrics. His power was absolute, radiating outward in silent, heavy waves that demanded immediate submission. His storm-gray eyes lifted from a leather-bound file on his desk, locking onto mine. The silence in the massive office was not empty. It was dense, electrifying, and tasted of dangerous promises and absolute control. I froze, every single hyper-vigilant survival instinct screaming at me to look away, to lower my gaze and assume the submissive posture of an employee who had accidentally wandered into the lion's den. But the fierce, unyielding pride my mother had instilled in me flared to life. I forced my chin up, meeting his intense stare with a quiet, terrified defiance. I was a forensic accountant. I dealt in facts. And the undeniable fact was, I had exposed his organization's financial vulnerabilities. If he intended to eliminate me, there was absolutely nowhere I could run. "Miss Higgins," the Don said quietly. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to resonate directly in my chest. It was the exact same voice that had listened to my drunken, hysterical breakdown just hours ago. Hearing it now, in the stark reality of daylight, sent a violent shiver down my spine. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of profound, terrifying ownership. I started, my voice betraying me as it cracked on the single syllable. I swallowed hard, forcing the dry panic down. "I assume you are the man who owns the gold embossed card." His expression did not change, but a subtle, dark flicker of approval passed through his eyes. He slowly closed the file in front of him, resting his large, strong hands flat on the polished surface of the penthouse desk. "I am Alexander," he replied, his tone remaining perfectly measured, betraying no emotion, but holding an immense gravitational pull. "And you are the woman who dismantled a highly encrypted laundering syndicate from a freezing apartment, with nothing but a shattered cell phone and a bottle of wine." A flush of deep, humiliating heat crawled up my neck. The memory of my tearful, slurred rant echoed mockingly in my mind. I had laid bare my absolute lowest moment, my pathetic poverty, and my shattered career to the most dangerous man in the city. "I thought I was calling my best friend," I stated, my fingers digging so hard into the wooden picture frame that my joints ached. I was intoxicated. I was angry. I didn't know who was on the other end of the line. "If I have breached your security protocols, I assure you, I have no intention of going to the authorities. I just want to be left alone." Alexander stood up, his movements fluid and entirely silent despite his massive size. He bypassed the heavy mahogany desk, walking slowly toward the center of the room where I stood frozen. The sheer physical distance between us closed rapidly. With every step he took, the intricate details of his power became sharper. The immaculate stitching on his lapel, the heavy gold watch on his wrist, the absolute unshakable calm in his demeanor. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from me. The proximity was overwhelming, sending my heart rate skyrocketing into a frantic staccato rhythm. I tilted my head back to maintain eye contact, refusing to step away even as my body trembled inside my damp, cheap wool sweater. "You have nothing to apologize for, Clara," Alexander murmured softly, the gravel in his voice softening into something that sounded dangerously close to reverence. "You did not breach my security. You exposed a terminal weakness within it, a weakness that arrogant, mediocre men attempted to exploit. You did me a profound service last night." He looked down at the pathetic cardboard box of my belongings I had left behind in my mind, shifting his gaze to the framed photograph I held against my chest. His eyes darkened, a flash of something fierce and protective tightening the strong line of his jaw. "Please. Sit," he commanded gently, gesturing toward a pair of plush, cream-colored leather armchairs positioned near the roaring fireplace. I hesitated for a split second, the deep-seated fear of being trapped warring with my absolute physical exhaustion. But my legs were shaking, the adrenaline crash from the morning's extraction finally catching up with me. I walked over to the chair and sat down stiffly, perching on the very edge of the immaculate leather. The warmth radiating from the hearth was an immediate shocking luxury against my cold, damp clothes. Alexander did not return to his imposing workspace. Instead, he took the seat directly opposite mine, leaning forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The power dynamic shifted, but the intensity only magnified. He was no longer a distant sovereign looking down at an intruder. He was a predator studying a fascinating, unexpected discovery. "Franco informed me that your extraction was smooth," the mafia boss began, his piercing stare tracking the slight tremor in my hands. "I apologize for the abrupt nature of the invitation. But considering the circumstances, leaving you in that building was not an acceptable variable." "Your security head paid my landlord," I said, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a rush of bewildered anxiety. "He said you paid my lease and my medical debts. You wiped out thousands of dollars before the sun even came up. Why? I don't work for you. I don't owe you anything, and I certainly cannot pay you back." The Don's jaw tightened. "You owe me nothing, Clara. The liquidation of your debts was not a loan. It was a fundamental correction of a gross injustice. A mind as brilliant as yours should never be paralyzed by the terror of poverty." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a folded sheaf of heavy, high-grade printer paper. He leaned forward and placed it gently on the low-glass coffee table between us. "This," Alexander stated, tapping the top page with a strong index finger, "is the Forensic Insights document. It is a complete, verbatim transcript of the voicemail you left on my private line. My intelligence team transcribed your exact mathematical breakdown of the harbor transit discrepancies." I stared at the black text spreading across the crisp white pages like a map of my own destruction. My eyes scanned the complex jargon, the maritime coordinates, the LLC routing numbers I had recited from memory in the dark. It was flawless. I had unknowingly handed an underworld kingpin the exact blueprint to his own bleeding ledgers. "I reviewed your findings," the Sovereign Protector continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimately serious. "You were entirely correct. Marcus Vance was utilizing a dummy corporation in Delaware to wash stolen tariffs belonging to my organization. He thought he could bury the missing capital under layers of executive logistics. He thought the standard auditors would blindly sign the reports. He thought you would quietly comply because you were desperate." I swallowed the dry lump in my throat, my forensic mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the collision between my small, desperate life and his invisible empire. "I refused to sign." "I know," Alexander said, his eyes locking onto mine with a burning, unapologetic intensity. "You chose total financial ruin over compromising your integrity. You chose the freezing rain over submission. That kind of unyielding pride is the rarest currency in my world, Clara. And I protect what I value." "Marcus fired me," I whispered, the residual sting of the humiliation flaring in my chest. "He told me I was completely done in this city. He said he would blacklist me from every firm on the East Coast." A cold, terrifying smile touched the corners of Alexander's mouth. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, promising swift, absolute violence. "The corrupt executive no longer possesses the authority to fire a junior clerk, let alone blacklist a brilliant auditor," he replied smoothly. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, Vance Financial ceased to exist as an independent entity. I acquired the entire firm through a proxy holding company. I bought the board. I froze his executive accounts. I stripped his name from the lobby. My heart stopped. The push notifications on my cracked phone hadn't been a hallucination. It was real. The massive, impossible corporate buyout had been orchestrated by the man sitting 2 feet away from me. You bought an entire financial firm just to... I trailed off, the concept too staggering to articulate. To correct an error, Alexander finished for me, his tone absolute. Marcus believed he could exploit your grief and your debts. He believed he held leverage. I simply demonstrated what actual leverage looks like. When my security teams entered the building this morning, they did not just change the locks. They handed him a physical copy of your forensic insights document. We highlighted the exact offshore accounts he used to steal from me. I gasped quietly, my fingers flying to my mouth. He knows it was me? He knows I exposed him? He knows that the woman he tried to crush is the reason he is currently sitting in a federal detention center, the mafia boss stated, his eyes gleaming with a dark, satisfied triumph. I arranged for the federal authorities to receive an anonymous, heavily encrypted tip regarding his tax fraud at dawn. By the time he arrived for his morning coffee, the FBI was already seizing his servers. He will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security prison, and he will spend every single one of those days knowing that his arrogance cost him his freedom. The sheer magnitude of the poetic justice hit me like a physical blow. The suffocating terror of my unemployment, the bitter humiliation of my walk through the open plan office, the arrogant sneer on my ex-manager's face. It had all been incinerated in a matter of hours. The bully who had terrorized me, who had used my mother's hospice bills as a weapon, had been utterly destroyed by the very numbers he thought he could manipulate. I sank back against the plush leather of the armchair, my lungs expanding fully for the first time in months. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me, so intense it brought fresh tears to my eyes. I didn't try to stop them. I let the tears fall, not out of despair this time, but out of a deep, shattering sense of vindication. The crushing weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders by a man I didn't even know. Alexander watched me cry in silence. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not awkwardly look away or attempt to rush my emotional processing. He simply sat there, a solid, immovable anchor in the storm of my relief, offering the quiet, respectful space I desperately needed. After several long minutes, the tears subsided. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, a gesture that felt incredibly small and unpolished in the immaculate luxury of the penthouse. "Why?" I asked, my voice thick but finally steady. "Why go to all this trouble for a stranger? You could have just taken the transcript and used it to quietly eliminate him. You didn't have to pay my medical bills. You didn't have to bring me here." The Don leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his massive frame closing the distance between us once more. The proximity was electric, sending a sudden, involuntary flush of heat through my veins. "Because in my world, loyalty and competence are not disposable commodities," he answered, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that made my breath catch. "Marcus looked at you and saw a desperate junior auditor he could exploit. I listened to your voice in the dark, and I saw a woman with an intellect sharp enough to secure an empire. You caught a multi-million-dollar leak that my entire internal security team missed. You understand the architecture of deception better than the men who built it." He reached out, his large, warm hand stopping inches from my trembling fingers resting on the glass table. He did not touch me, respecting the physical boundary with a meticulous, deliberate restraint that only heightened the unspoken tension between us. "I do not want you to return to that freezing apartment, Clara. I do not want you scanning the job boards for another mediocre firm that will fail to recognize your brilliance," Alexander declared, the absolute certainty in his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "I am offering you the position of forensic accountant for the Ravellini organization. You will have your own suite of offices on this floor. You will have unrestricted access to my private ledgers. You will answer to no one but me." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the monumental shift in my reality. Yesterday, I was a disposable clerk drowning in debt. Today, the most dangerous man in Boston was asking me to audit the mafia. "Your ledgers," I whispered, the analytical side of my brain automatically engaging. "If Marcus was washing funds for someone inside your organization, that means you have an internal mole. A leak within your own house." Alexander's eyes flashed with dark, predatory approval. "Exactly. The corrupt executive was merely the external mechanism. The man feeding him the logistics from the inside is a rival associate of mine named Enzo Gallo." Enzo has grown ambitious. He is skimming from the harbor transit accounts to build his own war chest. And you want me to prove it, I realized, the puzzle pieces rapidly snapping together in my mind. You want me to trace the internal digital footprint of the missing capital. You want me to find the undeniable mathematical proof of his betrayal so you can. I swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence, fully aware of what the Mafia did to traitors. So I can remove him. Permanently, the Sovereign Protector finished for me, his voice devoid of any hesitation. I need a mind I can trust unconditionally. A mind that cannot be bought, intimidated, or compromised. You proved last night that you possess exactly that. I looked down at the Forensic Insights document resting on the glass table. The numbers were my language. They were the only thing in the world that made absolute sense to me. For the past 2 years, I had used my skills to quietly protect corrupt corporate executives who despised me. Now, this terrifying, powerful dawn was offering me a chance to use my intellect to dismantle them. The transition from absolute powerlessness to sudden, undeniable agency was intoxicating. I was not a victim anymore. The crushing debts were gone. The toxic manager was in a federal cell. The only thing standing between me and true financial independence was my willingness to step over the moral boundary that separated the legitimate world from the shadows. If I do this, I said slowly, lifting my chin to meet his intense, storm-gray gaze. I forced my voice to remain perfectly level, negotiating not as a frightened employee, but as an equal holding a highly specialized set of skills. If I take this position, I require absolute transparency. No hidden accounts, no restricted access to the maritime databases. If I am going to audit your empire, I need to see every single ghost transaction in the ledger. Alexander did not flinch at my demands. In fact, the faint, dangerous smile returned to his lips, this time carrying a profound, genuine respect. He recognized the shift in my posture, the sudden return of the fierce, unyielding pride that had initially captivated him. You will have unrestricted clearance to every single digital vault I own, he promised, his voice a low, heavy oath. And in return, Clara, you will have my absolute, uncompromising protection. No debt collector will ever call your phone again. No corporate manager will ever raise their voice to you. You will operate under the full weight of the Ravellini name. Anyone who attempts to threaten you, to intimidate you, or to harm you in any way, will answer directly to me. The sheer weight of his vow settled over me like a heavy protective blanket. It was the ultimate safety fantasy realized in the most unexpected, dangerous form. I had spent my entire adult life hypervigilantly guarding my own back, fighting a relentless war of attrition against poverty and exploitation. The exhaustion had seeped into my very bones. To be told, with absolute certainty, that I never had to fight alone again was a salvation I hadn't known I was desperate for. My desk. I started, glancing around the massive penthouse office. Where exactly will I be working? Alexander stood up, gesturing toward a set of frosted glass double doors, located just off the main executive space. Franco has already prepared a corner suite for you, directly adjacent to mine. It is fully integrated with our highest security mainframe. It possesses the exact same harbor views, but with significantly better coffee than Vance Financial. The dry, subtle humor in his tone broke the remaining tension in the room. A small, genuine, incredibly fragile smile touched my lips. It was the first time I had smiled in months. I accept the position, Alexander, I said quietly, the finality of the decision echoing in the quiet room. I was no longer the disposable junior auditor drowning in medical debt. I had stepped through the looking glass into a world of bespoke suits, bulletproof glass, and underworld justice. The terrifying power of the dawn waiting at the top was no longer a threat. It was my shield. And as I looked at the printed transcript sitting on the table, I knew that Enzo Gallo and his corrupt internal network were about to learn exactly how dangerous a determined accountant could be. The game had fundamentally changed, and for the first time in my life, I was holding the winning hand. The heavy, protective blanket of Alexander's vow settled over me, a profound shift in the fundamental reality of my existence. I had accepted the position verbally, allowing the sheer, intoxicating rush of vindication to guide my words. But Alexander Ravellini was a sovereign predator who understood how easily a broken person's trust could be shattered. He knew that a woman who had spent her entire adult life being exploited by corrupt corporate systems would never fully exhale until the terms were permanently secured. He stood up from the plush leather armchair, his tailored charcoal gray suit shifting silently with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to absolute command. "A verbal confirmation binds my honor, Clara," the mafia boss said softly, walking back toward his massive hand-carved mahogany desk. "But you are a forensic accountant. You do not survive on promises whispered in a penthouse. You survive on empirical data. You require hard numbers, legally binding clauses, and undeniable proof." He unlocked a secure biometric drawer built seamlessly into the desk and withdrew a thick, cream-colored document envelope. The material was exceptionally heavy and richly textured, the kind of bespoke parchment utilized for international treaties rather than standard corporate hires. He returned to the glass coffee table, placing the envelope squarely in front of me. Beside it, he laid a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that caught the warm light of the roaring stone hearth. "This is your formal employment contract," the Don stated, retaking his seat opposite me. His dark irises watched me with that same intense, protective patience, offering me the physical space to process the transition. "Read it, every single page. I want you to understand exactly what it means to operate under my jurisdiction." My fingers, still bearing the faint, healing cut from last night's broken plastic corkscrew, reached out and touched the thick document. Only 12 hours ago, I had stared at the cheap red wine, spreading across the white tablecloth like blood, seeping through gauze, believing my entire professional career had been permanently extinguished. Now, I was sitting in the apex of Beacon Hill, being offered an unbreakable lifeline by the king of the Boston underworld. I pulled the paperwork from the envelope. The very first page detailed the compensation structure. I blinked, my analytical brain stalling completely for an instant as I processed the digits printed in stark black ink. The base salary was staggering. It was exactly 10 times the meager, insulting figure Marcus Vance had been paying me to keep his fraudulent books balanced. It was accompanied by a signing bonus that, by itself, could have paid off my late mother's entire oncology debt twice over. I read the numbers again, half expecting them to vanish, like a cruel hallucination brought on by exhaustion and panic. But the ink remained solid, unmoving, an undeniable testament to my newly established worth. The raw financial power staring back at me was an entirely different language, one of absolute control and uncompromising dominance. It was the language Alexander Ravellini spoke flawlessly, and he was choosing to arm me with it. But it wasn't just the sheer volume of capital that stunned me. It was the meticulous, comprehensive benefits package detailed on the second page. Full, elite-tier medical, dental, and vision coverage effective immediately. A dedicated corporate expense account with no ceiling for investigative resources. And then, I reached the third page, the security and severance clauses. At Vance Financial, my employment agreement had been riddled with predatory loopholes, aggressive non-compete clauses that effectively held my career hostage, and a termination policy that allowed the corrupt executive to discard me without a single cent of severance. Alexander's contract possessed no non-compete clause. It contained no leveraging language designed to bleed me dry. Instead, there was a specific legally binding paragraph titled Absolute Career Protection. Section 4, I whispered aloud, my voice trembling slightly as I read the unbelievable terms. In the event of external threats, legal harassment, or physical danger arising from prior or current employment, the Ravellini organization assumes full, unconditional liability for the employee's defense and personal security. "You work for the family now," the sovereign protector explained, his cadence a deep, heavy rumble that vibrated with absolute, terrifying authority. "The corporate world you left behind operates on petty threats, quiet intimidation, and the ruthless exploitation of the vulnerable. My world operates on a completely different frequency. We rely on extreme, unwavering loyalty, and we provide extreme, unwavering protection in return. If a debt collector ever manages to find your new number, my legal team will bury them. If a former associate attempts to smear your reputation, my security network will silence them. You are shielded, Clara, completely and permanently." Alexander's secure phone buzzed on the mahogany desk across the room while I reviewed the final pages of the contract. I shouldn't have looked, but my eyes flicked toward the illuminated screen instinctively. It was a rapid notification from the exterior perimeter, a silent, blinking reminder that the fortress I was sitting inside was heavily guarded by armed men who answered only to the man sitting in front of me. The juxtaposition was staggering. A world of extreme violence operating just beyond the reinforced walls, existing solely to ensure my absolute safety. I looked back down at the heavy parchment. There were no hidden traps here. No predatory clauses designed to weaponize my poverty. It was a document built on absolute, undeniable respect for my intellectual value. He wasn't buying my soul. He was buying my unparalleled competence. And he was paying exactly what I was worth. It was the ultimate subversion of the corporate hierarchy that had sought to destroy me. Here, in the shadows of the Boston underworld, I had found the profound, uncompromising fairness that the legitimate world had violently denied me. Every single clause, every meticulously drafted paragraph, was designed not to bind me, but to unleash the full terrifying scope of my analytical power without fear of retaliation. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. The cool, polished metal felt incredibly grounding against my damp skin. For 2 exhausting years, I had signed my initials on thousands of low-level expense reports, always terrified of making a mistake that would cost me my livelihood. Now I pressed the nib to the thick paper, my hand perfectly steady. I signed my full name, the ink flowing smoothly, creating a dark, definitive line that severed me entirely from the victim I had been yesterday. The mafia boss watched the ink dry, a dark, deeply satisfied gleam illuminating his storm-gray eyes. He reached across the glass table, his massive hand gently taking the documents and slipping them back into the envelope. "Welcome to the organization, Miss Higgins," he murmured, standing up to his full, imposing height. He extended his large, warm hand toward me. I stood up, my damp, cheap wool clothes feeling entirely incongruous with my new elevated status, and placed my hand in his. The physical contact was electric. His grip was firm, lightly calloused, and radiated an overwhelming, sovereign heat that sent a sudden, involuntary flush of warmth straight to my core. It wasn't a standard corporate handshake. It was a physical vow. A tactile sealing of the pact we had just forged in the quiet of his penthouse. The scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne wrapped around me, grounding me in the overwhelming reality of the moment. "Let me show you your new domain," the Don said, gently releasing my hand and turning toward the frosted glass double doors located just off the main executive space. I followed him across the massive penthouse, my footsteps silent on the deep Persian rug. He pushed the heavy doors open, revealing a space that instantly short-circuited my exhausted brain. At my former firm, I had been assigned a tiny, particle-board cubicle located adjacent to the employee break room. It had smelled perpetually of burnt microwave popcorn, fluorescent ozone, and quiet desperation. It was a cramped, windowless box designed to remind me daily of my absolute insignificance within the corporate machine. The corner suite prepared for me was a sprawling, immaculate sanctuary of forensic power. Floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows wrapped seamlessly around 2 sides of the room, offering an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the churning gray waters of the Boston Harbor and the towering cargo ships moving slowly through the freezing November mist. The rain lashed against the thick, bulletproof glass, completely muffled, incapable of touching the pristine warmth inside. The room was climate-controlled to absolute perfection, carrying the faint, clean scent of expensive leather and polished granite. In the center of the suite sat a massive, custom-built stone desk, its surface cool and entirely uncluttered. Mounted onto the desk was a state-of-the-art workstation that made my old corporate setup look like an ancient relic. 3 ultra-high-resolution monitors formed a curved, immersive arc of digital real estate. An ergonomic chair, crafted from soft, dark leather, sat waiting behind the screens. The processing towers were completely hidden, but the quiet, powerful hum of the liquid-cooled mainframe was unmistakable. It was the kind of elite hardware utilized by federal intelligence agencies, a system capable of crunching billions of data points in a matter of milliseconds. A thick, securely shielded Ethernet cable ran directly into the floorboards, connecting the suite's private server to the vast, hidden infrastructure of the estate. "The network is entirely air-gapped from the public internet," Alexander explained, stepping into the room right behind me. His large presence filled the suite, heavy and intensely protective. "You have direct encrypted access to the core shipping ledgers, the offshore tax filings, and the routing accounts Enzo Gallo has been manipulating. The decryption keys are already loaded onto your terminal. When you are ready, you can begin the hunt." "It is perfect," I breathed, my trembling fingers trailing lightly over the cool granite edge of the desk. The sheer magnitude of his investment in my professional capability was overwhelming. I traced the edge of the smooth stone, feeling the solid reality of my new position anchoring me in place. "I will leave you to settle in," the mafia boss said softly, pausing in the doorway. Franco has dispatched a team to retrieve a completely new wardrobe for you, tailored to your exact measurements. It will arrive within the hour. Do not push yourself too hard today, Clara. You have survived a brutal night. He pulled the frosted glass doors shut, leaving me completely alone in the pristine quiet of my new sanctuary. The silence in the magnificent suite was not empty. It was heavy, absolute, and tasted of cedarwood and impenetrable security. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, the crushing, hyper-vigilant knot of panic in my chest began to slowly, miraculously untangle. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't hyperventilating over the aggressive knock of a debt collector. I was utterly, profoundly safe. The physical manifestation of Alexander Ravellini's protection surrounded me in every square inch of the impenetrable glass and heavily encrypted servers. I walked around the granite desk and sank into the leather chair. It yielded perfectly to my spine, supporting my aching, exhausted muscles. I reached out and touched the sleek mechanical keyboard, but before I could even enter the first decryption sequence to expose Enzo's fraud, a soft, polite knock sounded at the secondary door leading to the private hallway. "Come in," I called out, my voice still slightly raspy from the crying fit I had endured hours ago. The heavy oak door opened, and a woman stepped into the suite. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with warm, incredibly expressive Mediterranean features and dark hair streaked with elegant silver, pulled back into a neat, traditional twist. She wore a pristine, tailored housekeeper's uniform, but her demeanor held absolutely none of the stiff, mechanical subservience of standard domestic staff. She radiated a deep, maternal warmth that immediately softened the intimidating, lethal edges of the mafia fortress. She carried a heavy silver tray, navigating the large room with practiced, graceful ease. The polished metal caught the ambient light, reflecting the quiet luxury of the sanctuary. On the tray rested a delicate, white porcelain coffee cup adorned with intricate gold trim, a small silver creamer, and a plate holding 2 freshly baked, sugar-dusted sfogliatelle pastries that smelled overwhelmingly of sweet ricotta and bright citrus. The aroma was intoxicating, a vivid reminder of the domestic warmth that ran beneath the cold, lethal surface of the Ravellini Empire. "Buongiorno, Miss Clara," the woman said, her voice rich with a thick, comforting accent. She set the tray down carefully on the edge of my granite desk, her movements meticulous. "I am Teresa Rossi. Don Ravellini instructed me to ensure you were immediately fed and warmed. You look like a strong breeze over the harbor could knock you down, Cara." I stared at the steam, rising in delicate, swirling ribbons from the porcelain coffee cup, my eyes suddenly prickling with fresh, unexpected tears. The sheer domestic kindness of the gesture was completely jarring, after the brutal corporate warfare and deep isolation I had just survived. "Thank you, Teresa," I whispered, my pale hands reaching out to wrap around the warm porcelain. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. It feels like a lifetime ago." The housekeeper's dark eyes softened with a profound, knowing empathy. She did not ask invasive questions about my damp, cheap clothes or the deep shadows of exhaustion bruising my face. The Omerta code extended deeply to the staff. They observed everything but judged absolutely nothing. "Alexander is a man of immense, heavy responsibilities," Teresa noted quietly, adjusting the silver napkin on the tray to ensure it was perfectly aligned. "He commands an empire built on violence and sharp edges. But I have managed this estate for 20 years, and I have never seen him dispatch his personal extraction team for an outsider in the middle of a sleet storm. He recognizes your incredible worth, Clara. You are family now. You are safe in this house." She offered a warm, deeply reassuring smile before turning and quietly exiting the suite, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with a sound of finality. I lifted the porcelain coffee cup to my lips. The dark espresso was incredibly rich, perfectly brewed, and sent a sudden, vital surge of energy rushing straight into my depleted bloodstream. The heat radiated from the delicate cup directly into my freezing, bruised fingers, a tactile anchor grounding me firmly in the present moment. I took a small bite of the warm, flaky pastry. The sweet citrus flavor was a shocking, beautiful contrast to the bitter taste of cheap red wine and sheer panic that had coated my mouth just hours ago. I set the cup down gently on its matching saucer. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the reality of my new sovereign existence to finally, completely settle into my bones. The crippling medical debts were liquidated. The eviction notice was irrelevant. Marcus Vance was sitting in a federal interrogation room, completely stripped of his unearned power. I turned my attention to the glowing monitors. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense lethal power at my absolute disposal. At my previous job, the legacy software had crashed if I opened more than 3 spreadsheets at once. Here, the liquid-cooled processor was designed to handle the encrypted terabytes of Harbor manifest instantly. I was no longer a victim. I was the lead forensic accountant for the Ravellini family. I typed in the decryption sequence, the heavy mainframe humming, as it unlocked the deepest, darkest financial secrets of the Boston underworld. The mechanical keys clicked with a satisfying, tactile weight under my fingertips, each keystroke a definitive strike against the men who believed they could manipulate the system unchecked. Enzo Gallo thought he was exceptionally clever. He thought he could skim millions from the Harbor transit accounts without leaving a digital footprint for the dawn to find. But he had never been hunted by a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The complex ledgers opened across the 3 screens, a cascading waterfall of raw numbers, offshore routing codes, and hidden capital. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing, my mind locking into its pristine, highly analytical state. The game had begun, and I was going to tear his corrupt network apart, ghost transaction by ghost transaction. The city of Boston had long since surrendered to the bitter November night, the chaotic energy of the financial district buried beneath the relentless, freezing rain. Outside the floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows of my corner suite, the harbor was a vast churning expanse of absolute blackness, broken only by the sweeping beam of a distant lighthouse and the slow, rhythmic blinking of navigation buoys. The storm hammered against the thick, bulletproof glass with a muted, rhythmic thudding, but the violence of the weather was completely powerless against the pristine, climate-controlled sanctuary Alexander Ravellini had built for me. I stared at the rain streaking down the pane, briefly remembering the bone-deep chill of my old rundown apartment, a life that already felt like a fading nightmare. Here, I was insulated, protected. Inside the room, the only illumination came from the 3 ultra-high-resolution monitors curving around my line of sight. The screens bathed the custom-built stone desk in a stark, cold blue light, casting long shadows across the polished granite. The quiet, powerful hum of the liquid-cooled mainframe was a constant, soothing vibration beneath the floorboards, a mechanical heartbeat that matched the intense, hyper-focused rhythm of my own pulse. The state-of-the-art forensic workstation was a masterpiece of technological power, entirely air-gapped and insulated from external networks. I had been submerged in the digital architecture of the Ravellini shipping empire for 17 straight hours. The sheer, staggering volume of the data would have paralyzed a standard corporate audit team. I was navigating through terabytes of highly classified maritime manifests, international tariff schedules, and layered offshore tax filings, delving deep into a secure, encrypted digital ledger containing the shipping manifests and tax records of his vast syndicate. To a forensic accountant operating at the absolute peak of her capability, the numbers were not an obstacle. They were a language. And the man I was hunting had left a distinct, undeniable accent scattered across the ledgers. Enzo Gallo was not a clumsy thief like the man sitting in a federal holding cell across town. Marcus Vance, my disgraced former manager, had merely been a blunt instrument, a localized mechanism used to wash stolen capital with pathetic, easily traceable corporate embezzlement tactics. But Enzo, the ambitious underboss operating deep inside the family's infrastructure, was the architect of a massive hemorrhage. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, entirely too confident in his ability to deceive the dawn. I leaned forward in the ergonomic leather chair, my eyes narrowing as I cross-referenced a series of maritime transport logs from the previous quarter. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, the keys clicking with a satisfying, tactile weight as I executed a complex predictive algorithm I had designed from scratch. I was hunting for the negative space. In sophisticated financial fraud, the evidence of theft is rarely found in the missing money. It is found in the operational friction required to move it. I pulled up the bills of lading for a fleet of cargo vessels that had supposedly docked in the Boston harbor during the second week of September. The gross tonnage capacities were perfectly documented. The municipal docking fees had been paid in full. The tariffs had been cleared through the standard regulatory channels. On the surface, the spreadsheet was a masterpiece of legitimate corporate logistics, a flawless illusion designed to pass any standard audit. But numbers never lied, even when powerful men desperately wanted them to. I split the center monitor, opening the fuel expenditure logs for the exact same week. I ran a rapid mathematical correlation between the recorded weight of the cargo and the cubic volume of diesel fuel consumed by the transport trucks assigned to move the containers from the docks to the regional distribution centers. The equation did not balance. It wasn't even a minor discrepancy that could be attributed to mechanical inefficiency or heavy traffic. The fuel consumption was mathematically impossible for the stated weight. There were zero fuel costs associated with the tonnage Enzo claimed to have moved out of the harbor. "You didn't move steel," I whispered to the empty room, my voice a raspy thread of sound in the quiet suite. "You moved air." The realization sent a sharp, thrilling spike of adrenaline straight through my exhausted system. I rapidly began to isolate the specific transit routes, tracing the routing codes attached to the phantom cargo. The underboss had not just been skimming a percentage of the legitimate profits. He had been fabricating entire shipments, inflating the operational liabilities of the Ravellini harbor, and funneling the non-existent tariff payouts directly into an encrypted offshore holding company registered in a series of untraceable international shell accounts. But as I dug deeper, peeling back the layers of the offshore accounts, the true, terrifying scope of the betrayal crystallized on the screen. I stared at the red deficit markers, spreading across the digital ledger like blood seeping through gauze. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my throat as the sheer magnitude of the anomaly became undeniable. The corrupt associate wasn't just stealing liquid cash. He was using the fabricated shipments to leverage massive, predatory loans against the actual, physical assets of the Ravellini organization. He was quietly placing liens on the commercial docks themselves, using the Don's own sovereign territory as collateral to build his private war chest. It was an act of profound, suicidal treason. If the market shifted, or if the international creditors called in the markers unexpectedly, the core infrastructure of the empire would be exposed to catastrophic financial ruin. The traitor had planted a ticking time bomb deep inside the foundation of the criminal syndicate, and the timer was already counting down. The silence in the corner suite was not empty. It was heavy, electric, and tasted of chilled ozone and impending retribution. I reached for the porcelain coffee cup sitting on the edge of the granite desk, desperately needing the grounding sensation of the dark espresso. But the porcelain was entirely cold, the intricate gold trim reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitors. I had completely lost track of time. My shoulders were stiff, burning with the accumulated tension of the relentless intellectual pursuit, and my eyes felt dry and granular from staring at the glowing pixels. The exhaustion in my bones was profound, an echoing reminder of the last 48 hours of terror, displacement, and miraculous salvation. But I could not stop. I refused to step away from the terminal. I highlighted the entire sequence of ghost transactions, compiling the undeniable, irrefutable mathematical proof of the internal coup into a single, secure master file. I had found the lethal vulnerability. I held the sword. Now I just needed to hand it to the king. "You should be resting, Clara." The deep, gravelly voice cut through the quiet hum of the servers, sending a sudden, violent jolt of electricity straight down my spine. I gasped, my hands flying off the mechanical keyboard as I spun the heavy leather chair around. I hadn't heard the heavy frosted glass doors open. I hadn't heard a single footstep on the thick Persian rug. But Alexander Ravellini was suddenly standing inside my private sanctuary, his immense physical presence instantly altering the air pressure in the room. The mafia boss had shed the immaculate, bespoke charcoal gray suit jacket he had worn earlier in the day. He stood before me in a crisp, dark dress shirt, the top two buttons undone, revealing the strong, tanned column of his throat. The sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, exposing thick bands of striated muscle and the faint, dark edges of intricate ink that disappeared beneath the expensive fabric. Without the formal armor of his tailored suit, he looked less like an untouchable corporate sovereign and far more like the lethal, dangerous apex predator who actually ruled the Boston underworld. He carried a heavy crystal tumbler in one hand, the amber liquid inside catching the ambient light of the monitors, and a fresh glass of iced water in the other. I lost track of the hour, I stammered, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The sheer proximity of the man was overwhelming. In the massive expanse of his penthouse office, his power had been intimidating. But here, in the secluded intimacy of my corner suite, In the dead of the night, the raw, magnetic pull of his presence was entirely suffocating. "What time is it?" "It is nearly 2 in the morning," Alexander replied, his tone remaining perfectly level, though a dark, intense flicker of observation passed through his storm-gray eyes. He walked slowly toward the custom stone desk, his movements holding that same fluid, terrifying grace. He set the glass of water down on the polished granite, pushing it gently toward my trembling fingers. "Drink. You have not hydrated since you began this audit." I reached out, my cold, slightly chapped fingertips brushing briefly against the icy condensation on the glass. The rough, dry texture of my own skin, worn out from hours of frantic typing and the brutal stress of the past few days, felt stark and entirely human against the pristine, heavy crystal. I took a slow, steadying sip, the freezing water soothing my painfully dry throat. "Thank you. I didn't mean to stay so late. I found a thread and I couldn't let it go." Alexander did not return to the doorway. Instead, he moved around the edge of the massive desk, stepping directly into my personal space. The scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne wrapped around me, heavy and intoxicating, instantly overriding the sterile smell of the liquid-cooled processors. He came to a halt right behind my ergonomic chair. The physical distance between us was entirely eradicated. I could feel the immense, radiating heat of his large frame pressing against the back of the leather seat. Every single biological alarm in my hyper-vigilant brain should have been screaming at me to create distance, to protect my boundaries from the towering, violent man standing over me. But instead of terror, a profound, shocking wave of absolute safety washed through my veins. The shivering exhaustion that had plagued me all day simply melted away in his shadow. He leaned forward slightly, resting one large, powerful hand flat on the granite desk beside my keyboard. His arm brushed against my shoulder, the casual, fleeting contact sending a terrifying, brilliant spark of electricity shooting straight into my core. "Show me the thread, Clara," the Sovereign Protector murmured, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that vibrated directly against my ear. I swallowed hard, forcing my highly analytical mind to override the sudden, overwhelming cascade of physiological responses his proximity was causing. I turned back to the glowing arc of monitors, my hands hovering over the keys. My fingers were visibly trembling, but the data on the screen was undeniable. "Enzo Gallo is not just skimming liquid capital," I stated, my voice gaining strength as the sheer brilliance of my forensic discovery anchored me. "He is much more dangerous than a simple thief." I correlated the maritime transit manifests with the regional fuel expenditure logs. "He has been fabricating entire fleets of ghost shipments for the past 9 months. Alexander remained perfectly still behind me. His dark eyes tracked the cascading rows of numbers on the center screen, his mind absorbing the complex data with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his empire. "Phantom cargo, to justify the missing tariff payouts. Yes, but that is only the surface mechanism," I continued, bringing up the secondary window containing the encrypted international shell accounts. I pointed to the glowing red deficit markers, acutely aware of how close his face was to mine. If I turned my head even a fraction of an inch, my cheek would brush against his strong jaw. "The real threat is the collateral." Enzo used the fabricated operational liabilities to secure massive, predatory loans from international creditors. "He didn't just steal your cash, Alexander. He placed highly leveraged liens directly against the commercial docks." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantaneously. The quiet, protective warmth radiating from the dawn vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying coldness that made the air feel suddenly thin. The temperature didn't physically drop, but the sheer, lethal intent rolling off his massive frame was suffocating. I had just handed him the mathematical proof that his own underboss was attempting to sell the foundation of the Ravellini Empire out from under him. "He leveraged my territory," Alexander said, his voice completely devoid of volume, yet carrying a destructive force that could level a city block. If the market experienced a downturn, or if those creditors called in the markers unexpectedly, the entire organization would be exposed to catastrophic defaulting, I explained, my forensic precision cutting through the rising tension. "He planted a bomb in your foundation, but I isolated the specific routing codes. I have the exact account numbers holding the borrowed capital. You can freeze the assets and quietly pay off the liens before the creditors even realize there is a structural vulnerability." Alexander did not speak immediately. He stared at the 3 monitors, the harsh blue light reflecting in the dark, stormy abyss of his eyes. The magnitude of the betrayal was immense, requiring swift, brutal retaliation according to the Omerta code. But as the silence stretched, the lethal tension slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, profound focus directed entirely at me. He shifted his stance, his large hands sliding from the granite surface to cover my smaller, trembling fingers resting on the computer mouse. The contact was deliberate, heavy, and completely electrifying. His palm was warm, the faint calluses rough against my pale skin. The sheer contrast between my delicate, exhausted hand and the undeniable, crushing power of his grip was a vivid, physical representation of our newly forged alliance. I stopped breathing, my eyes dropping to our joined hands. He wasn't crushing my fingers, he was anchoring them. He was grounding me in the terrifying reality of his world. My internal security apparatus spent 6 months hunting for a leak, utilizing millions of dollars in surveillance technology. The Don murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over the faint healing scar on my skin. The gesture was incredibly gentle, an agonizingly intimate touch that sent a rush of heat straight to my chest. That found nothing but shadows. You sat in this chair for 9 hours, and you dismantled a catastrophic internal coup with nothing but raw, uncompromising intellect. I looked up, tilting my head back to meet his gaze. The distance between our faces was practically non-existent. I could see the faint, dark stubble shadowing his strong jaw, the intense possessive appreciation burning in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me as an employee. He wasn't looking at me as a broken woman he had rescued from a freezing tenement. He was looking at me as a brilliant, equal partner who possessed the exact power he needed to secure his sovereignty. "I promised you absolute transparency," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips as the unspoken subtext between us grew unbearably heavy. The numbers do not lie. They just require someone willing to listen to the truth. Alexander leaned closer, his chest brushing against the back of my chair, effectively caging me entirely within his protective shadow. "You just saved my family millions, Clara," the mafia boss declared, his voice a dark, velvet oath that sealed the fate of the traitorous associate and irrevocably altered the trajectory of my life. "The corrupt underboss will be dealt with before the sun rises. Permanently, discreetly, and you will never have to doubt your worth in this city again." He slowly withdrew his hand, the sudden loss of his tactile warmth, leaving a desperate, aching chill in its wake. He stepped back toward the heavy frosted glass doors, the lethal predator preparing to execute the swift, violent justice his empire demanded. But before he crossed the threshold, he paused, looking back at me with a fierce, unwavering devotion that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. "Lock the terminal. Go to sleep," Alexander commanded softly, the absolute finality in his tone echoing in the quiet sanctuary. "The war is over. You have already won." The heavy frosted glass doors clicked shut, severing the intense, suffocating magnetic pull of Alexander Ravellini's presence from my quiet sanctuary. I was alone again, but the profound, terrifying isolation that had defined my entire adult life was completely gone. I sat in the ergonomic leather chair, the residual heat of his large hand still burning like a brand against my knuckles. My heart was pounding, a frantic, erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with the freezing rain lashing against the bulletproof windows, and everything to do with the absolute, uncompromising protection the sovereign king of Boston had just draped over my shoulders. He had told me to lock the terminal. He had told me to go to sleep, assuring me that the war was over, and my exhausted, bruised body desperately wanted to obey. My eyelids were incredibly heavy, the dull, throbbing ache of yesterday's hangover, and the relentless 48 hours of terror finally demanding their toll. The soft, dark leather of the chair yielded to my aching spine, practically begging me to surrender to the fatigue. The scent of his cedarwood and dark spice cologne still lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a heavy, invisible blanket. I had spent 2 years working in this sterile, passive-aggressive environment of Vance Financial, where every day felt like walking on broken glass. Now sitting inside the fortress of the Ravellini Empire, I felt a strange, intoxicating sense of absolute safety. I reached for the mechanical keyboard, my fingers hovering over the keys to initiate the deep encryption sequence that would secure the digital ledger for the night. I needed to sleep. I needed to let the men with the guns handle the rest of the violence. But before I could strike the first key, the center monitor of my advanced forensic workstation flickered. It wasn't a mechanical glitch. The liquid-cooled processor beneath the custom stone desk hummed, flawlessly, completely air-gapped from the chaotic public internet. The anomaly was strictly numerical. The red deficit markers I had just isolated, the exact offshore holding accounts containing the massive predatory loans Enzo Gallo had leveraged against the commercial docks, suddenly began to pulse. A new, unauthorized sequence of data cascaded rapidly down the right side of the screen, overriding the static ledger with live, volatile commands. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The bone-deep exhaustion vanished instantly, replaced by a violent, icy spike of pure adrenaline. The numbers were moving. Someone was actively accessing the encrypted offshore accounts in real time. I leaned closer to the harsh blue light, my eyes scanning the complex routing codes with frantic surgical precision. The corrupt associate wasn't waiting for the morning. Marcus Vance's sudden, highly public arrest by federal agents at dawn must have triggered a catastrophic panic within the underboss's network. Enzo knew his external laundering mechanism had been dismantled. He knew it was only a matter of hours before the Dawn's intelligence team started turning over stones. He was initiating a desperate, scorched earth protocol. He was attempting to liquidate the leveraged loans, drain the stolen capital from the international shell accounts, and sever the digital trail before fleeing the city. If he successfully transferred those funds into an untraceable cryptocurrency ledger or a decentralized dark web exchange, the money would be permanently gone, and the massive liens placed against the Ravellini docks would default, triggering the exact catastrophic financial ruin I had just warned Alexander about. The foundation of the empire would crack. Millions of dollars of maritime assets would be frozen by federal regulators by sunrise. "No, you don't," I whispered fiercely, my voice vibrating with a sudden unyielding authority. I was not the terrified, disposable junior auditor, drowning in medical debt anymore. I was the lead forensic accountant for this empire, and this was my domain. Enzo Gallo was not going to steal a single cent while I was watching the ledger. I shoved the leather chair back, the wheels gliding smoothly over the polished floor, and bolted toward the heavy glass doors. I didn't care about my unpolished appearance or my lack of formal shoes. I sprinted out of the corner suite, the cold marble of the hallway transitioning sharply as my socked feet sank deep into the pristine Persian rug of the massive penthouse. The transition from the sterile, high-tech environment of my office to the luxurious, classical architecture of the estate felt like crossing between two different centuries. Alexander was standing near the private elevator bank, the sleek metallic doors just beginning to slide open. Franco Moretti was beside him, holding a secure tablet, already receiving the initial tactical orders for the morning strike. The air around them was dense, charged with the lethal, heavily disciplined violence of men preparing for war. They were predators standing at the absolute apex of the city's food chain. "Alexander, wait!" I shouted, my voice echoing loudly across the immaculate, cedar-scented office, shattering the quiet discipline of the room. The mafia boss spun around instantly. The cold, ruthless predator vanished the second his sharp gaze locked onto my panicked face. He closed the physical distance between us in 3 massive, fluid strides, his large hands reaching out to grip my shoulders, stabilizing my trembling frame. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice's low, heavy rumble of immediate concern. His thumb brushed against my collarbone, a tactile anchor meant to ground my rising panic. "Are you hurt, Clara?" I gasped, struggling to catch my breath as I looked up into his intense gaze. "Enzo. He knows about Marcus. He's panicking." I was about to lock the terminal, but the offshore accounts just went active. "He is initiating a massive, decentralized wire transfer right now. He is trying to liquidate the leveraged assets and drain the harbor funds before he runs." The numbers are cascading across the external servers. Franco stepped forward, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Can he move the capital that fast? If he utilizes an automated algorithmic dispersal, yes, I explained rapidly, my forensic mind operating at absolute maximum capacity, stripping away the fear and leaving only the cold logic of the numbers. He can shatter the stolen capital into 10,000 microtransactions in under 5 minutes. If those hit the dark web exchanges, they are gone forever. But the transfer requires a localized authorization ping to bypass your internal firewall. If we trace that ping right now, we can pinpoint his exact physical location. We can catch him before the money clears. Alexander didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He didn't question my expertise or demand further proof. He simply dropped his hands from my shoulders, wrapped his arm firmly around the small of my back, and guided me swiftly back toward the corner suite. The physical warmth of his body pressed against my side was a vivid, shocking contrast to the cold terror of the situation. His absolute trust in my intellect was a heavy, intoxicating validation. It was the exact opposite of Marcus Vance's belittling corporate tyranny. "Show me," the Don commanded as we crossed the threshold into the blue-lit sanctuary. I slid back into the ergonomic chair, my fingers striking the mechanical keys with a blur of aggressive, highly disciplined motion. Alexander stood directly behind me, his massive hands resting on the back of my chair, his intense focus creating a heavy, impenetrable shield around my workspace. Franco stepped into the room moments later, sealing the heavy doors behind him. "I am writing a counter-algorithm to intercept the dispersal protocol," I narrated, my eyes locked on the cascading data, refusing to blink. "I'm telling the mainframe to hold the external authorization packets in a digital quarantine. It will look like a standard network latency issue on his end, giving us a 3-minute window. I am trapping his data inside a temporary firewall loop. Can you isolate the digital trail?" Alexander asked, his voice vibrating right next to my ear, sending a sudden, involuntary shiver down my spine. The smell of his cologne, rich cedarwood and dark spice, enveloped me entirely. The proximity of his massive frame was overwhelming, yet it was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. "I am doing it right now," I replied, bringing up a complex, 3-dimensional routing map on the left monitor of my high-end forensic workstation. He is bouncing the signal through proxy servers in Estonia and Singapore to mask the IP. It is a standard evasion tactic. But he made a fundamental error. He is using the organization's own maritime logistics software as the carrier frequency to hide the transaction. He thought the system would blind us, but it actually gave me the exact breadcrumb I needed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, stripping away the fake proxy layers one by one. The red digital line on the map snapped back from Europe, zooming directly into the eastern seaboard of the United States. It narrowed rapidly onto the Massachusetts coastline, plunging straight into the churning, storm-battered grid of the Boston Harbor. "Got him," I breathed, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across my exhausted face. I hit the final execution key, locking the exact coordinates onto the center screen in bold, undeniable text. He isn't running yet. He is physically sitting inside the commercial docks. The signal is pinging directly from the primary control room at the commercial docks. He is using a hardwired terminal to bypass the wireless security. He is right in the middle of your territory. I had isolated the digital trail in real time, catching the traitorous underboss in the exact moment of his betrayal. Enzo Gallo had attempted to outsmart the system, but he had collided with a forensic accountant who refused to be beaten. I had built the cage out of code, and now the mafia boss was going to lock the physical door. Alexander stared at the glowing coordinates, the harsh blue light illuminating the lethal, uncompromising rage tightening the sharp angles of his jaw. The betrayal was no longer just a set of numbers on a spreadsheet. It was a physical target, currently trespassing on his sovereign territory. The muscles in his forearms contracted, a subtle warning of the violence he was about to unleash. "The commercial docks," the mafia boss repeated, his tone so dangerously quiet, it felt like the air pressure in the room had suddenly dropped. He slowly removed his hands from the back of my chair, stepping away from the desk. The transition was instantaneous. The warm, protective presence that had anchored me vanished entirely, replaced by a ruthless warlord, preparing to execute absolute justice. Alexander reached inside the tailored breast pocket of his crisp, dark dress shirt and withdrew a heavy matte black tactical security radio. It was a brutal military-grade piece of hardware, completely devoid of corporate elegance. The device looked stark and violent in his large hand, a physical manifestation of the raw power that governed his massive organization. He pressed the transmission button. A brief crackle of encrypted static sliced through the quiet hum of my liquid-cooled processors. It sounded like crushed glass and impending ruin. "All perimeter units. This is the Dawn," Alexander barked into the radio, his words a dark, gravelly weapon that demanded immediate, unquestioning obedience. "Initiate Protocol 0. The harbor is now under absolute lockdown. Nothing moves in or out, no vehicles, no vessels, no exceptions. The gates are closed permanently until I say otherwise. Copy that, boss." Protocol 0 engaged, a distorted, hyper-alert voice replied through the speaker. "The main gates are sealed. The perimeter is secure." Alexander turned to Franco, who was already withdrawing his own sidearm from a concealed shoulder holster. checking the chamber with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. The sheer normalcy with which they transitioned into a state of lethal violence was staggering. Yet, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the men holding the weapons. I was terrified for the man they were hunting. Enzo Gallo was about to face the terrifying consequences of crossing a sovereign protector. He had stolen from Alexander Ravellini, and he had underestimated the forensic accountant tracking his every move. "Franco, take the Alpha and Bravo assault teams," the Don commanded, his intense stare locked onto the digital map on my monitor. "Enzo is currently barricaded inside the primary control room at the commercial docks. He is armed, and he has likely brought a detail of his own corrupt loyalists. I want the mainline power to those specific docks cut immediately. Plunge the terminal into absolute darkness. Blind his cameras. Silence his communications. He will operate entirely in the dark until we arrive. We will breach through the subterranean utility tunnels." The head of security responded smoothly, his face a mask of cold, predatory anticipation. "We will trap them inside the control box. No one escapes. The exits will be blocked before the power even drops." "I do not want a chaotic firefight on the docks," Alexander warned, his tone absolute. "This is not a war. It is an execution. Neutralize his guards. Bring Enzo to his knees. I want him alive when I arrive. He needs to understand exactly who dismantled his empire before I dismantle him." "Consider him contained, Don Ravellini," Franco said, offering a curt, highly respectful nod, before turning and striding swiftly out of the corner suite. The heavy frosted glass doors closed behind him, leaving Alexander and me alone in the blue-lit sanctuary. The sheer intensity of the moment hung heavily in the air. I sat frozen in my leather chair, my hands still resting on the polished granite desk. I had spent 2 years working in the sterile, passive-aggressive environment of corporate finance, where revenge meant a bad performance review or a sonnet in the break room. I had never witnessed the terrifying, immediate deployment of underworld justice. I had handed Alexander a digital vulnerability, and he had instantly transformed it into a physical cage of steel and violence. It was the ultimate, uncompromising poetic justice against a man who believed he could steal without consequence. Marcus was a corporate bully who used human resources to destroy lives. Enzo was a mafia traitor who used bullets and financial leverage. But the man standing in my office was the apex predator who commanded both worlds, and he was unleashing his fury on my behalf. He was taking the broken pieces of my career and forging them into a weapon. Alexander clipped the tactical radio to his belt. He turned back to me, the lethal, cold edges of his demeanor softening marginally as he looked down at my exhausted, wide-eyed expression. He walked slowly around the desk, closing the distance between us once more. He didn't stop until his long legs brushed against my knees. The transition from the warlord giving execution orders to the man checking on my emotional state gave me a profound sense of whiplash, but it was incredibly grounding. He reached down, his large, warm hands gently cupping both sides of my face. The contact was unexpected, intimate, and incredibly grounding. His palms were warm against my chilled skin, the rough calluses offering a tactile reassurance that sent a violent, beautiful flutter straight to my chest. He tilted my head up, forcing me to meet his intense storm-gray gaze. I stared up at him, entirely captivated by the swirling depths of his eyes. "You were brilliant, Clara," he murmured, his voice a low, rough whisper that vibrated deep within me. "You didn't just find the leak. You caught the rat with his teeth in the trap. You have proven your worth to this family tenfold. The intellect you possess is a weapon more dangerous than any gun Franco carries. You saved the foundation of this empire tonight." "He might try to fight his way out," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, the adrenaline crash finally beginning to take hold. The reality of the violence about to unfold at the commercial docks was terrifying. "Alexander, he is cornered. He knows what you do to traitors. He is going to be incredibly dangerous. He has men with him who are just as desperate to avoid federal prison or a mafia execution." "Let him try," the mafia boss replied, a dark, terrifying smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He is a coward who steals in the dark. He does not possess the strength to survive the storm he has just provoked. But you will not be anywhere near that violence." His thumbs brushed lightly over my cheekbones, wiping away an imaginary tear, anchoring me to the absolute safety of his presence. The gentle motion was a massive contrast to the brutal orders he had just given. It was the signature dichotomy of Alexander Ravellini. Ruthless to his enemies, impossibly tender to the woman he had decided to protect. Listen to me very carefully, Alexander commanded, his tone shifting into a fierce, unwavering vow of protection. I am going to the harbor to finish this. You are going to stay exactly where you are. I am placing 2 of my most elite guards directly outside this door. The penthouse elevator is locked down, and the exterior security grid is fully activated. You are inside a vault, Clara. No matter what happens at the docks tonight, no matter what you hear on the news tomorrow, you are untouchable. Do you understand? I stared into his eyes, seeing the raw, unapologetic devotion burning in the dark depths. This man, a ruthless criminal to the outside world, was treating me with a level of care and profound respect I had never experienced. He was going into danger, and his primary concern was ensuring my absolute peace of mind. The heavy, suffocating weight of hyper-independence that had defined my life for so long finally cracked, dissolving completely under the warmth of his hands. I didn't have to fight the entire world by myself anymore. I understand, I replied softly, my hands coming up to lightly grasp his strong wrists. I felt the steady, powerful pulse beneath his skin. Please. Just be careful. Do not let him surprise you. Alexander's jaw tightened, a flash of deep, possessive emotion crossing his features at my words. He leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss against my forehead. The gesture was chaste. Yet, it carried an incredible, heavy weight of intimacy that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a promise of return, a seal of absolute ownership and protection. It was the final affirmation that my old life of fear and poverty was officially dead. He pulled back, his eyes lingering on my face for a fraction of a second longer, before he turned and strode out of the suite. His tailored charcoal gray coat billowed slightly around his knees, a dark shadow moving purposefully toward the coming storm. The heavy glass doors closed with a definitive click. A moment later, the electronic deadbolt engaged with a solid metallic thud. I was locked inside the sanctuary. I turned back to the 3 ultra-high-resolution monitors. The digital routing map on the left screen still showed the glowing red target locked onto the commercial docks. The quarantine algorithm I had written was holding the funds perfectly, a frozen waterfall of stolen capital that Enzo Gallo would never be able to access. The numbers were secure. The ledger was closed. I had done my job, executing the forensic insights document directly into the operational heart of the syndicate. Outside the thick, bulletproof windows, the freezing November rain continued to hammer against the glass, a chaotic, violent symphony that matched the ruthless justice about to unfold on the Boston harbor. But inside the climate-controlled suite, the air smelled of cedar wood and safety. I pulled my knees up to my chest, curling into the ergonomic leather chair. The crushing, relentless exhaustion finally overtook the adrenaline. I didn't need to hyperventilate. I didn't need to panic about tomorrow's eviction, or the medical debts for my mother's past treatments. The night Marcus Vance left me standing in the freezing rain, with my career in a cardboard box, was the moment my life fractured, only to be entirely rebuilt by the most dangerous man in the city. I closed my eyes, the quiet hum of the liquid-cooled processors of my elite forensic workstation lulling me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I was completely confident that the man who had bought my world was currently securing my future. I drifted upward through the heavy, suffocating layers of exhaustion, my consciousness slowly, reluctantly reattaching to the physical world. For a long, disorienting moment, my brain struggled to process the sensory input surrounding me. The air did not carry the familiar, depressing scent of damp plaster, chemical cleaning supplies, and boiled cabbage that permanently haunted my old tenement building. Instead, it was rich and layered, carrying the distinct scent of polished leather, chilled ozone from the server racks, and absolute, impenetrable security. My spine was not aching against the lumpy, broken springs of a second-hand sofa, nor was it stiff from sleeping on a public transit bench. It was perfectly supported by the soft, yielding upholstery of an ergonomic chair that likely cost more than my first car. A thick, incredibly warm cashmere blanket had been draped carefully over my shoulders while I slept, cocooning my shivering, overworked frame in a profound, unfamiliar sense of safety. I was entirely untouched by the bitter cold outside. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the stark, crisp blue light illuminating the sprawling corner suite. The 3 ultra-high-resolution monitors of my cutting-edge forensic workstation were exactly as I had left them, curving around my massive stone desk in a continuous, glowing arc of digital real estate. The clock in the lower right corner of the center screen read 7:14 a.m. I stared at the blinking white digits, my pulse giving a weak, confused flutter. I had slept for over 5 hours. I had slept entirely through the climax of the violent underworld war I had initiated with a single desperate sequence of code. I sat up, the heavy cashmere blanket slipping slightly down my arms, pooling into a luxurious mound of dark gray fabric around my waist. I leaned closer to the glowing pixels, my breath catching in my throat, as I reviewed the final status of the digital ledger. It was flawless. The quarantine counter algorithm I had written in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic had executed with absolute, uncompromising perfection. The massive, decentralized wire transfer the underboss had attempted to initiate to drain the harbor funds was completely frozen, permanently trapped inside the temporary firewall loop. The multi-million dollars in stolen capital had been successfully bounced back into the secure internal network, fully intact and untainted. The phantom shipments were erased from the operational queue, the digital ghosts banished from the system. The highly leveraged liens against the commercial docks were entirely exposed, isolated, and neutralized. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the suite clicked open. The sound was soft but unmistakable, cutting through the low hum of the liquid-cooled processors. Alexander Ravellini stepped into the sanctuary. He had shed his bespoke charcoal gray suit jacket. The sleeves of his crisp, dark dress shirt rolled up to the elbows to reveal the thick, striated muscle of his forearms and the faint, shadowed edges of ink wrapping around his wrists. He looked entirely exhausted, the lines around his mouth carved deep by a night of orchestrated violence. Yet he still radiated the terrifying, lethal energy of an apex predator who had just successfully defended his territory. The smell of freezing rain, cold steel, and dark cedarwood rolled off his massive frame, instantly overriding the sterile scent of the technology surrounding me. Franco Moretti walked silently behind him, his posture rigid and highly disciplined, his tailored jacket bearing the faint, damp traces of the brutal harbor storm. Alexander bypassed the seating area entirely and walked straight to my custom stone desk. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a small rectangular object, and dropped it onto the polished granite. The plastic clattered loudly in the quiet, climate-controlled room. It sounded like a gunshot. I stared at it. It was a deactivated keycard, a standard magnetic stripe security pass, bearing the official corporate logo and the specific access clearance for the primary control room at the commercial docks. The edges of the plastic were scuffed, smeared with a faint trace of grease and something entirely darker, something that looked distinctly like dried blood. It belonged to Enzo, I stated, my voice slightly raspy from sleep. It did, the mafia boss confirmed, his gravelly voice echoing with an absolute, terrifying finality. He rested his large hands on the edge of the granite desk, leaning forward to meet my gaze. The operation was executed exactly as you plotted it, Clara. Franco stepped forward, his dark eyes meeting mine with a level of profound, stoic respect I had never once received from any corporate executive in my past. The Alpha and Bravo tactical teams breached the subterranean utility tunnels, precisely at 0245 hours. The head of security reported, his cadence low, methodical, and entirely devoid of residual adrenaline. We severed the mainline power to the specific transit docks, plunging the primary control box into absolute darkness. The traitors' corrupt loyalists were heavily armed, expecting a frontal assault, but they were entirely unprepared for a tactical blackout. We utilized thermal optics and advanced suppression tactics. We neutralized his guards in less than 60 seconds. There was no chaotic firefight. It was a surgical, highly disciplined suppression executed by men who own the shadows. Alexander took over the narrative. His storm-gray eyes darkened as he recalled the final confrontation. The corrupt underboss was barricaded behind the main server console, desperately attempting to manually override your quarantine algorithm. When I stepped into the pitch-black room, he was already beaten. I dropped a single tactical flashlight onto the floor, illuminating the printed Forensic Insights document I had brought with me. I handed him the exact mathematical breakdowns you had verified. The Don's jaw tightened, a flash of cold, ruthless satisfaction crossing his sharp features. He read the routing codes, Clara. He saw the ghost shipments, the offshore holding accounts, the leveraged liens. He realized in that exact moment that his brilliant hidden treason had been completely dismantled by an auditor he didn't even know existed. The terror in his eyes was not born from the weapons my men were holding. It was born from the undeniable realization that his intelligence had been vastly, permanently eclipsed. What happened to him? I asked quietly, my forensic mind requiring the final data point to close the equation. I needed to know the absolute cost of my mathematics. Enzo Gallo is quietly and efficiently removed from the organization's network, Alexander stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. He will never access a shipping manifest, a dockyard, or a bank account again. The threat to my family is permanently neutralized. The offshore liens are being quietly liquidated using our secure reserves, Franco added, offering a curt, highly professional nod. The corporate audit is officially closed. You saved the physical foundation of the docks, Miss Higgins. I leaned back against the soft leather chair, the profound weight of my accomplishment settling deep into my bones as the realization of what I had done sank in. For 2 years, I had been treated as a disposable junior clerk, a quiet girl with a calculator who could be bullied into submission. Marcus Vance had tried to destroy me for refusing to compromise my integrity, mocking my desperation and leveraging my mother's hospice debts to keep me silent. But here, in the shadows of the underworld, my intellect had been weaponized to execute absolute justice. I had dismantled a multi-million-dollar coup from a desk chair. The crushing anxiety that had plagued my entire adult life simply evaporated, replaced by the staggering realization that my unmatched value to the empire was now an undeniable, permanent fact. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their salvation. I looked back at the monitors, my fingers lightly touching the mechanical keyboard. I will initiate the final decryption sequences to fully integrate the recovered capital back into the primary ledgers. I offered, my professional instincts automatically engaging, seeking the comfort of logic and structured data. I can scrub the external proxy servers to ensure no residual tracking data remains on the federal grids. Alexander reached out, his large, warm hand gently covering my trembling fingers, instantly stopping my movement. The physical contact was a vivid, shocking jolt of electricity that grounded me entirely. The raw heat of his skin against the lingering chill in my knuckles sent a sudden, violent shiver straight up my arm. The servers can wait, Clara, the Sovereign Protector murmured, his intense gaze softening into something fiercely protective. You have worked enough for one lifetime. The war is over. It is time for you to finally rest. The violent sleet storm that had battered the city for 2 days finally exhausted itself by late afternoon, surrendering to a quiet, heavy snowfall that blanketed the chaotic streets in a pristine layer of white. I had spent the majority of the day sleeping in the luxurious East Wing guest suite, my exhausted body demanding complete shutdown after the adrenaline crash of the past 48 hours. When I finally emerged, the towering glass monolith of the headquarters felt entirely different. It was no longer a terrifying, mysterious fortress filled with dangerous men and lethal secrets. It was my home. Teresa Rossi found me in the massive, state-of-the-art penthouse kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of dark espresso from the gleaming Italian machine. The warm, maternal housekeeper offered a knowing, affectionate smile as she set a plate of freshly baked sfogliatelle on the granite island. The delicate, flaky pastry smelled of orange zest and sweet ricotta, a sharp, comforting contrast to the bitter coffee in my hands. Eat, Kara. You are too thin, and you have saved our family today, Teresa gently scolded, her heavily accented voice wrapping around me like a warm embrace. She then reached onto one of the tall bar stools and handed me a heavy garment bag that had been delivered directly from a high-end Newbury Street boutique. Don Ravellini wishes for you to accompany him outside. He insists you wear this. I unzipped the thick canvas garment bag, my breath catching in my throat at the sheer, undeniable luxury of the item inside. It was a bespoke woolen winter coat, dyed in a deep, rich burgundy that felt like a quiet, poetic homage to the cheap red wine I had spilled on the night my old life ended. The garment was an absolute masterpiece of tailoring, the kind of clothing I used to admire through frosted shop windows, but could never dream of affording. The wool was incredibly dense and heavy, fully lined with a layer of soft, dark silk that glided smoothly over my skin, instantly trapping my body heat. The physical contrast between this immaculate, protective shield and the threadbare, damp jacket I had worn 2 nights ago was staggering. I buttoned the coat up to my collarbone, realizing that I was now completely insulated from the biting cold of the city. I was wrapped in his protection, even when he wasn't touching me. I found Alexander waiting for me at the ground-level security entrance. He wore his signature heavy charcoal gray overcoat, his broad shoulders easily filling out the tailored fabric, making him look like an imposing, immovable mountain of a man. When his storm gray eyes locked onto me in the burgundy coat, a flash of deep, possessive approval darkened his gaze. It was a look that made the breath stall in my lungs. "Walk with me," he requested, his gravelly voice unusually soft, a sharp departure from the lethal commands he had issued just hours prior. We stepped out of the reinforced glass doors and into the freezing November evening. We left the armored SUVs and armed security details behind, staying within the invisible perimeter of the estate as we moved along the water. The snowfall muffled the chaotic noise of the financial district, rendering the usually bustling city entirely silent. The vintage wrought iron street lamps cast warm, golden halos against the falling snow, illuminating the cobblestone path that ran parallel to the churning, icy waters of the harbor. We walked in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sound the satisfying, rhythmic crunch of fresh snow beneath our heavy boots. The physical proximity of his massive frame was a constant, radiating source of heat, a tactile reminder of the absolute, unconditional protection I now commanded. I looked out over the churning gray waves of the harbor. The massive commercial docks loomed in the distance, their towering steel cranes resting quietly under the clearing winter sky. They were secure, they were sovereign. And they belonged to the man walking beside me solely because of the numbers I had balanced, the codes I had cracked, and the unyielding loyalty I had offered in the dark. Alexander stopped near the edge of the water, turning to face me. The snow caught in his dark hair, melting instantly against the warmth of his skin, glistening like scattered diamonds under the golden streetlights. Marcus Vance was officially processed by the federal courts this afternoon, the mafia boss stated, his tone conversational but laced with a lethal, absolute satisfaction. His corporate assets have been entirely seized. He was denied bail. The holding companies managing your mother's hospice debts have been permanently liquidated. The ghost transactions are erased from the ledger. I looked up at him, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The sheer magnitude of his words crashed over me. Everything that had suffocated me, everything that had kept me awake at 3 a.m, paralyzed with terror. It was all gone. "The equation is balanced," I whispered, the forensic accountant in me, acknowledging the absolute symmetry of the justice he had executed. He had destroyed my monsters just as thoroughly as I had destroyed his. "The financial equation is balanced," Alexander corrected, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that sent a sudden, violent shiver straight to my core. He stepped closer, eliminating the physical distance between us entirely. He reached up, his large, warm hands gently framing my face, his thumbs brushing lightly against my freezing cheekbones. The rough calluses on his skin felt incredibly grounding against the biting winter air. "But the ledger of our partnership is just beginning." I stopped breathing, completely captivated by the raw, unapologetic devotion burning in his dark eyes. He wasn't looking at me as an employee. He wasn't looking at a broken woman he had rescued from a dilapidated tenement. Nor was he looking at a convenient tool to fix his empire. He was looking at his equal. "I am a man who deals in absolute control and inevitable violence, Clara," the sovereign king murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with an agonizingly gentle touch. "My world is dangerous, complicated, and entirely unforgiving. But you stepped into the absolute center of my underworld, armed with nothing but a shattered cell phone and an unyielding moral compass, and you brought a traitor to his knees." He leaned down, his forehead resting gently against mine, the scent of his cedarwood cologne wrapping around me like a heavy protective blanket. "I do not just want you auditing my ledgers. I am not asking you to love the criminal. I am asking if you can love the whole complicated mess of who I actually am, and stand beside me to rule this empire." The tears that gathered in my eyes were not born from panic, or exhaustion, or the terrifying isolation that had defined my entire adult life. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. I had spent years building walls, perfecting the art of being invisible to protect myself from a society that viewed me as entirely disposable. Alexander didn't just break those walls down. He replaced them with a fortress of his own design, a fortress where I was respected, protected, and completely adored. "I accept," I whispered, my trembling hands reaching up to grip the lapels of his heavy charcoal coat, anchoring myself to the only man who had ever truly seen my worth. He didn't hesitate. He captured my mouth in a fiercely possessive, deeply emotional kiss that completely shattered the final, lingering remnants of my hyper-vigilant defense mechanisms. The kiss was a vow, a tactile sealing of the pact we had forged in the dark. It tasted of espresso, winter air, and absolute victory. The freezing wind whipped around us, but I felt absolutely nothing but the overwhelming, sovereign heat of the man holding me. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The federal authorities would continue to dissect the ruined firm of my former manager. The Ravellini organization would continue to navigate the violent, high-stakes currents of the Boston underworld. Life would continue in all its complicated, dangerous glory. But right now, wrapped in his arms with the quiet, snowy city as our witness, I had absolutely everything I needed. The crushing debts, the eviction notices, the pathetic corporate bullies. They were gone forever, incinerated by a single drunk message left on a private line in the dark. The scars on my wrist and the grief in my heart from years of grinding poverty remained invisible but permanent, marks that would never completely fade. But they no longer defined me. They were simply part of the map that had led me here, to this exact moment, to this impossible sanctuary. I wasn't just a disposable junior auditor anymore. I was the queen of his empire, and the ledger of my life was finally perfectly balanced.